All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are across the country. Welcome to our Children, Our Future, First Nations Child and Family Services and Self-Determination, to our virtual gathering, our first virtual gathering, Introduction to an Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families. As per our tradition, we'll start our session with Knowledge Keeper Edmund Sekeny from Albany First Nation, or Fort Albany First Nation. So we'll start our session, and I defer to you, Elder Sekeny.
Wachek Misli. Pasto Managishigo with Pitabego Capechemia. It's really a nice day here from where I'm speaking from Pitabego. That's what we call it. Fort Albany, the English name, the French name. Ogamaganesta na pisum Capeche Waste. And for the sun, the sunshine that's shine upon us. Takayo Hapajish. It's cold a little bit, but it makes it for a nice day. No tao kishamanto. Kinagat penjige miswebu. No chataya humapamatizwan. I acknowledge the great creator that is the creator of all things as we deal with this thing called life. Nagachehinat, look after us. Anama Akuzangapichispanic COVID-19 Gatonoa. During this sickness that has come our way, COVID-19. Matiga Nigiskawak, Namojamak Nabokamak, Mushtakok, Oma Utaskilunum, Mashkilubok Taskilun, Kataya. I just like to acknowledge the spiritual grannies and grandpas of the ancestral land of the Mushkegowak. Ogamaka Nestakino, Kaitaya, Antebu. Wherever you are, I also like to acknowledge the grannies and grandpas of your area. Koyisvago, we do tenan. We're all here to try to deal with life in a good way. And for the children, from all our areas, and for the new ones from all our areas. I'd just like to thank all of you for coming forward to this meeting, this session we're having. And also to look after yourself. Matiga Migoshetog, Aniganchik, COVID-19. I'd just like to thank the leaders and those pandemic teams from our communities who are really working hard to not have this COVID-19 take over our communities. In our area, they've been doing well. And here at Pitabego, the pandemic team has done really a superb job. Animan, it's hard, but they're doing it for the interest of the people. And they've done it for the new ones, the children, the youth, the adults, and the elders. I have finished my prayer, and I ask each of you to also say a prayer. I've completed my prayer, and I greet all of you. Have a good meeting.
Elder Sekeny. as for, like, I always enjoy starting our sessions with the elder because it always grounds us in what we're about to endeavor into. So this is going to be an exciting virtual session. So welcome everyone once again to our Children, Our Future, First Nations Child and Family Services Self-Determination, our virtual gathering, our first virtual gathering, introduction to the Act, respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis children, youth and families. What I'd like to acknowledge the elder, acknowledge the territory that I'm coming to you from, which is Algonquin territory. One thing that I want to make sure that we have, everyone takes care of themselves. I think that, the topics that today's discussion may elicit some emotional responses. We want to make sure.
All right, I'm here. I'm testing my sound. How's that?
So do take care of yourself. Also, there is the Hope and Wellness Helpline is available to provide mental health supports by phone and by chat. So we should have a PowerPoint coming up showing us a little bit exactly where you can contact. So to provide support, 1-855-242-3310 to connect the online chat, or hopeforwellness.ca. So those are supports available to you should you need them as a conversation is forward. So we're not going to try to do this in isolation. We want to make sure you have the supports for you to participate fully. You can ask questions throughout the day with the waving person icon, which is supposed to be in the top right-hand top of your screen. So if you do have questions as the presenters or the panelists come up, we will have the opportunity to ask those questions. If you are listening via teleconference, that means we cannot see you and you cannot see us. If you have emails or questions, there is the C92 forum at afn.ca. So small c 92 forum, forum at afn.ca. And you can provide your email. You can email there and get your questions into our participants or our panelists. If you have trouble on your device, there is technical assistance available to you. So you can call 1-833-236-8324, starting, well, already started about 45 minutes ago, or all the way to 4 p.m. if you are having technical issues, and we'll try to resolve that for you or help you resolve those. Sometimes the issues are where you are as opposed to here, so we'll try to find different solutions to make sure you can fully participate. We'll do our best. We know these processes and these virtual sessions are not ideal. We don't have the ability to go past time. We don't have breaks where we're all together to ask questions. So we're trying to accommodate as many comments as questions as we can during the session. So I have some help in terms of looking at the questions. If there are common questions, we'll group them together, and then we can ask those. We will also track all the questions and comments. So even though perhaps you don't hear your question being asked or that being answered, we will make sure that we have all the content that you have provided, all the questions and comments will be saved, and we will follow up on all those different items that you have brought. So don't fear that you're not being heard. There are not just the online, but also offline. There are accompanying websites with all the bios, and the agendas are also there. I believe you've been sent the link to that. So you should be able to have accompanying with us as you're going through our sessions. There should be a website that'll help you with materials, bios, and some introductions in terms of what we're going to accomplish during each of the sessions. So this is the first of 5 sessions over the spring. Again, the www.afn.ca. The goals, I have identified some goals in terms of our 5 sessions. Learn about the new Indigenous Child and Family Services legislation, and that's what we're going to try to do today. Hear dialogue amongst First Nations, service providers, and government officials about the Act, priorities for First Nations implementing the Act, and changes that come with implementation, and that's going to be our next virtual session. We're going to hear input from elders and former First Nations youth and care on systemic reforms that are needed. We'll share emerging promising practices from First Nations implementing the Act, and we'll also understand the new tools for First Nations children, youth, and communities to support the best interests of the child. So you can see that lots of different topics we'll be going over during these virtual sessions. Of course, we're focusing on introduction to legislation today. Again, the resources available on the AFN website, the agendas and everything are there. For our speakers throughout the virtual gathering series, we'll be providing donations in their name to 2 organizations that support First Nations youth as they transition out of child and family services. The Mamawi Wichiitata Center offers programs for youth in and from care, including housing and youth transition from care and family unification programs. The Luma Native Housing Society's Aboriginal Youth Mentorship Program.
Here are some
supports will also be provided. So we're also part of the organizations that we're providing supports for donations on behalf of our participants or our presenters. So I think that you'll notice today we'll have some introduction remarks or some welcoming remarks from the National Chief. We'll hear from the Regional Chief, Kevin Hart. We will have a panel presentation of elders and youth. We will then have a keynote speaker who's going to join us this hour or later on, which is Dr. Tapel Lafond, and she'll have a keynote speaker with which you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. And we'll wrap up our day with Minister Miller. So we promise to give us enough time and make sure you get all your comments and all your thoughts when we can with the ministers there, but also, of course, we'll be able to follow up afterwards with the other items. I believe that's enough talking from me. That's probably the most I'll talk, promise. I'm big on promises I can't keep. But with that, I don't know if our National Chief is ready at this moment, but what I'll do is I'll go straight to Regional Chief Kevin Hart with some opening remarks. Of course, Regional Chief Kevin Hart is the Manitoba Regional Chief and the National Portfolio Holder for Social Development Files at the AFN, including Child and Family Services. Regional Chief Hart is also Chair of the Chiefs Committee on Child and Family Services and Self-Determination. With that, please help me welcome Regional Chief Kevin Hart.
I want to thank you, Matt, for that introduction. I want to greet everybody from the beautiful Treaty 1 territory here on the Saugeen First Nation. And of course, right now, during this special pandemic time, I want to extend my love and prayers to everybody out there during this time that are experiencing this pandemic. For the ones that have lost loved ones, our love and prayers go out to you during this time. I know that our knowledge keepers have told us that to be strong and to be vigilant, and that we've survived past pandemics and past genocides, and to remind everybody about that. And some of those fights and struggles that we talk about continue today. And during COVID-19, you know, obviously I want to tell everybody, please wear a mask, use hand sanitizer at all times, and wear gloves if you have to go out for only essentials. You need to listen to this, because it's only going to be you for us to flatten this curve in our nations, to take care of our most precious resources. That's our elders, and especially our children, and the ones that we're talking about here today when we talk about C92. I want to thank our knowledge keeper, Ed Sakanay, for his opening prayer and starting us off in a good way, of course. And, you know, I'm presenting virtually, as I stated this morning in my greeting from the Treaty 1 territory, and would like to acknowledge all the traditional territories that are out there this morning joining this gathering. As the Assembly of First Nations Social Development Portfolio Holder and Chair of the Chiefs Committee on Child and Family Services and Self-Determination, it's my honor to welcome all the chiefs, elders, and youth, and all our special guests to this first session in a series of gatherings that will take place over the next 4 months. I've had the honor of working with First Nations and pressing Canada over the past several years to get to where we are today with national legislation that affirms our rights as First Nations to care for our children and our families according to our laws, practices, and values. And that's something that's very fundamental and very important. This milestone marks a significant shift from where we were even just a few years ago. For example, in 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found that Canada was discriminating against First Nations children and families in its provision of child and family services after the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society launched a complaint in 2007. The tribunal called for changes to ensure that First Nations children are treated fairly and equitably, and that First Nation families are not discriminated against simply because they are First Nation. The calls for change in First Nations child and family services are long-standing. We can look at such reports as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1996, the Wenday reports of 2005, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, and the calls to action in 2015 of our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as well in their report in 2016. Along with numerous provincial and territorial and First Nation produced reports that have been guided by chiefs, our women, and our knowledge keepers that have all highlighted the need for change in child and family services to address the severe over-representation of First Nation children in child and family services systems. These reports all echo what First Nations have known for decades. The current system does not work for us. And this has been so apparent for myself as the regional chief here in Manitoba, where we have some of the highest rates of apprehensions, as well as you know, birth alerts has been a major issue in the past. There has been legislation introduced to that. But, you know, when we talk about caring for our children according to our own ways, it's imperative to reducing the number of First Nation children and youth involved in child and family services and ending this humanitarian crisis. The legislation you see before you is one tool to support this, reaffirming First Nations' right to care for our children, to create our own laws that are grounded in our cultures, teachings, traditions, protocols, and also to develop our own laws and systems to support child and family well-being. This is imperative because when we look back, for example, before the Royal Proclamation, of course, we go forward to the Indian Act and such, and of course, the treaty-making processes. We had laws and protocols in place, and especially when it came to the care of our children, everyone had a role, our grandmothers and our women, and you know, that's something that has to be reconciled, is that loss of that connection between mothers and grandmothers and such, with what has happened in the past with birth alerts. And you know, I have not outruled bringing forward a class action for all the birth alerts that have been put in place, and for the atrocities and, you know, the separations between mothers and children unnecessarily in the past. So, you know, this is the hard work of our Chiefs Committee, as well as the work that we do with Canada to make sure that we negotiate the steps to implement the new legislation, including developing a protocol agreement between the Assembly of First Nations and Canada to outline a First Nations distinctions based to implementing the legislation. And that's very important, given that we have a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government, the Crown, before that, and that also our rights are protected, not only in the Constitution, but also that we look at the inherent rights and such. And this is where the importance when we talk about rewriting our own laws. Of course, our Chiefs Committee will continue to ensure that First Nations rights and authorities are respected as the implementation of the legislation moves forward. It is not an option for Canada to lead this work unilaterally, and this is something that I've been very imperative with the direction of the chiefs and the knowledge keepers to keep pressuring Canada that this is not going to be led by you. It's going to be led by First Nations and by our people to go back and recreate these laws that we're going to bring forward that were outlawed. And, you know, of course, we were subjected to laws and legislation and policy that has resulted in mass critical poverty, unnecessary child apprehension due to the chronic shortages of housing, water infrastructure, and even more so now during COVID-19, we see that and how it's affecting children in care. So, you know, this is something that we do not see included, and that we want to make sure that when we move forward, that anything that we don't see included in the legislation, despite our advocacy, you know, we made sure to make statutory funding to support First Nations was in this work as part of the protocol agreement. Funding is imperative, as you know, to the legislation being implemented properly. I've heard this time and time again from chiefs, from grand chiefs, from knowledge keepers and such about the funding and how it's needed to support it. You know, provinces have been funded to the amount of billions of dollars when it comes to taking care of our children. And, you know, it's imperative for First Nations from all regions that they need the additional supports right now to develop these laws, to establish the systems, and also advancing the priorities when it comes to the well-being of their children and their family. National Chief will note that there was an investment late in December that there was an announcement of $242 million over 5 years to support capacity building and engagement regarding the legislation. This investment came nowhere near what the AFN had advocated, and myself on behalf of the Chiefs Committee and such, for the support for First Nations in this transition to First Nations control. We made it well known to the preliminary estimate to the federal government that an investment is needed for us to do the transitioning of the First Nation Authority under the Act to be $3.5 billion over 5 years, so $542 million over 5 years is clearly something that was the federal government missed the mark. In many cases, First Nations are building from the ground up, as you know. We need to establish new laws and reinvigorate traditional laws after years of colonialism, after years of our laws being outlawed and banished altogether through federal and provincial law. We need to negotiate and make sure that agreements with provincial agencies to ensure that the principles under the legislation is adhered to, for example. Because once a First Nation, and this is something that's very important right now for all the First Nations out there, is that you need to serve notice for one. And what that means is you need to send the BCR to trigger the process that you want to start a process of writing your own laws when it comes to the jurisdiction and the sovereignty of your children. We know for a fact through the tribunal rulings, and for example, that Canada has intentionally underfunded and discriminated against First Nation children and families for generations. It is time that Canada steps up and funds First Nations based on actual needs in a way that allows for planning and stability so that First Nations can make this transition in a good way. I will continue to remind Canada of their duty to ensure implementation of the legislation moves ahead properly, including funding for First Nations and regions to undertake this work. And that is my my commitment to you as national portfolio holder for our children. When I take this role as a leader, I take it very strongly with the utmost humbleness, because, you know, as we gather today and over the next several sessions, for example, I want to remind you to keep our teachings of the 7 generations close to your heart. We must never forget the generations that have come before us. They've paved the way for the changes that we are working to implement today. We must also never lose sight of the generations to come for whom we are making these changes. And this is something that leadership and knowledge keepers have told me time and time again. This is something that our treaty chiefs have told me time and time again. No, we're all working together to ensure a better future for First Nations children and families. And I hope that this series of sessions will provide you with knowledge from our elders and our youth, and as well as from fellow First Nation leaders as we move forward to work together. And, you know, last but not least, I want you all to be safe, be well. Remember, you're safe at home, you're not stuck at home. We need to do this for the next little while. Please, we just need to be a little bit more patient and vigilant for the well-being of what I think are most precious resources, and that's our children, as we were reminded, as I sit here in the Saugeen First Nation, of our late great leader and our late elder knowledge keeper, Elmer Crishane, who told us and shared with us. So, you know, I just want to share that with you, with everybody today. Say Miigwech Glasani. I want to thank you for joining us today, as well as to acknowledge the prayer in the territories across this vast land during this time. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Matt.
Miigwech Regional Chief, appreciate those opening comments. I think was what Elder Crishane used to say, it's about the little ones and love. I think the two things that always I remember about Elder Crishane were those two things, always about the little ones and love. Were probably his two wisest things he said to us. I never introduced myself. My name is Matthew Crishane. Bonjour en mine. I'm also from Saugeen First Nation. I'm here in the Algonquin Territory. We are missing a presentation. We'll get to that presentation later. We are scheduled to have a panel conversation next. And I don't think our participants or our panelists will be here till 1 o'clock. So just a quick reminder that there's the Hope for Wellness helpline that's available to you. And sometimes our conversations will get a little heavy, and we do want to make sure you're able to take care of yourselves. I know in COVID, sometimes people are isolated. So we do want to make sure that you are supported in our conversation. 1-855-242-3310 is the number, or their website is also hopeforwellness.ca. So there's a little reminder of that. Again, because we're virtually, we can't always get to everyone's questions. So there is the little hand or little waving man guy in the corner. I forget what we call that icon. There's an icon. We have a name for him. We call him waving person icon. There, see, that's how imaginative we are. At the top right corner of your screen. So make sure you tap on that if you want to ask a question. Of course, we won't be able to get to all the questions. So C92FORUM@afn.ca. Send in your questions. Sometimes you're on teleconference, so we won't be able to get those questions on the screen. So do send those to the email. If you have any questions, we'll do our best to get to everyone's comments and questions during the session, of course, but time is always our enemy, and long presentations can also be our enemy. It is 20 to 1. Let's take a little early break. Let's get our panelists together. I'm expecting some words from the National Chief, but we will share that with you as soon as we get them or as soon as he's available. So we will go to that when we have it. But till then, let's just go to our panel presentations. And that's what we'll do. I'm just checking to make sure from my instructions. Do I have any instructions? No, okay, we'll move to this afternoon. Just another quick reminder, just to put your phones on mute or your feed on mute, and so that we don't get any feedback during the sessions. Again, please take care of yourselves, respecting others is always my motto when facilitating these sessions. I think I'm out of things to say. I've stretched this on as long as I can. Let's take a quick break. Let's reconvene at 1 o'clock with our first panels, Elders, Guidance, and Former Youth in Care, Perspectives on an Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families. So we'll have our elders and our youth gather with us at 1 o'clock. Take care, grab a snack, grab a drink, grab some tea. Be back here at 1 o'clock. Meet with everyone. Talk soon. Got a text. We don't have a picture.
It's telling me I can't start my video because the host stopped it.
Hey,
Oh,
back. You're back.
I'm back.
Bonjour, Ani, Matthew Krishnendej Nikas. Welcome back to our Children, Our Future First Nation Child and Family Services and Self-Determination, our virtual session, first virtual session of 5. We're at the point of our agenda where we're talking about elders, guidance, and former youth in care, perspectives on Enact Respecting First Nations. We're moving to a panel presentation. We will have 4 panelists joining us to provide an overview or give a presentation of about 10 minutes each, and hopefully at the end we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&As. We have a reminder to everyone, there's a standing and waving guy hand in the front top right-hand corner, where you can send us a chat or send us a email to c92forum@afn.ca. A couple of reminders, some people are also on the phone or perhaps have their phone and their laptop We would ask that you mute both. Sometimes we get the mute on the laptop, but perhaps we're not muting our phones. Just a little heads up, we're getting some feedback on the phone line. So if you are using your phone, if you could mute your phone somehow, that would be much appreciated. I'm trying to think of where we're going next. We do have 4 panelists. I'll introduce our panelists. Traditional helper Elaine Kiknoswe, Pizukwe Links woman from Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation from Saskatchewan. And Elaine, we have knowledge keeper Edmund Sakami, who opened our session from Port Alberni First Nation. Ed, very much. We have Erickson Owen from the Poplar Hill First Nations. Hey, Erickson, how are you? And we should have joining us soon Cheyenne Amandaman from Shoal Lake number 39, Abiniki Bimadizwin, Braids of Life Youth Advisory Council out of Manitoba. Welcome, panelists. Welcome to our conversation. Say hello to the world that's looking at you. The world is looking at you. Don't be nervous. Everything will be fine. With that, I'll go in the order as I introduced them, and I'll give the floor to Elaine.
Bujuani Tansi Kwekwachi Seko, Elaine Dishnakaz, Mangan Dodam, Pelican Stonjaba, but I live in the Ottawa region. I want to thank you for inviting me and talking about what they call this era of child welfare. Child welfare has been in our communities for many, many years. We're now within like 3rd or 4th generation within child welfare. So the reality is I was born at the time where I would be either within some form of institute. I was born at the time where I was either at residential school, and in my community, it was Prince Albert Indian Residential School, or I would have been born at the time of the day school. I was born at the time when child welfare was already grasping so many of our children within what we call now the 60s scoop. So we have these different labels that are placed on us as children. Neglected, abandoned, in that light of knowing our mothers or our community would not raise us. I was born in that era. And some of that is also understanding how we got there. The reality is there was changes within the Indian Act in the 50s that gave the permission. They were already apprehending us for residential schools. So we have to go back in our history. Remember, we have to know where we've come from, to where we're going, to where we've been. So the policies started in the 50s, and then the 60s scoop started, and then the 70s, and then we end up with the millennium scoop. So when I speak, I only speak of the era of when it was the blacked out time. They didn't always tell us what nation we were. They didn't always tell us what community we were. They didn't always tell us that we were First Nations. That was that time and that era. So I missed out on what they say, what does a traditional family life cycle mean? You know, those rites of passage. And identity, like who am I? The clan, the family, the nation, the community. And what they call the healthy or unhealthy behaviors or relationships that I developed early in life, because I was one that they didn't have this time to say, oh, keep it consistent for the child. So I was sent to several foster homes that also started my, and this is, when I speak, it's only from my experience, where I had a disengaged attachment because I knew that I wouldn't be there for long. So I've maintained this, always this, I gotta go somewhere in my adult life today. I'm always on the go. So when you address that disengaged attachment, we're really talking about what is healthy for me. What is healthy in the honesty and not feeling that I owe somebody. So there seems to be this this thing of waiting for someone to tell us what to do. And that stems from that childhood experience. So when you wash it all away and really work within your trauma, your childhood attachment, your disengaged, and all those different places of where you were, then you're doing some really, really in-depth work and coming back to what they say, the holistic way of life that the Creator wanted you to have. The holistic life, that the prayers that were placed forward even when you were being carried by your parent and your community. So when you're coming back, as they say, and there's no, and that's what I have to say, Canada doesn't have a national relocation program for us to come home. We have to either take it on our shoulders, or we go back to child welfare and say, I want to be reunited with my family. But if they're the ones that took us out, then that's where that sarcasm, that anger, that I'm not going to go back there. So then we take it upon ourselves. And for myself, I saved for 2 years. And this is in the 90s when there was no program to be reunited. So there's that feeling of, who will I meet? So I just drove home. I took a plane ticket. I always knew I was born in Flin Flon, Manitoba. I knew I was already under the Bill C-31. I knew what nation and band where I was from. And I just showed up at the band office and said, hi, my original name is this. I was always told this is the name of my mother, Jean McDermott. And I would like to get to know her. Do you know how I can get a hold of her? And that's just a small example of how we're being reunited. We take it upon our shoulders. And that's a lot to carry, because there's no financial, there's no emotional, there's no spiritual, not unless you've already done a bit of your work. And then that the continuum of the relationship to stay connected. So I was born at the time that my file was sealed. And I was fortunate to have really kind people within my adoptive home that they shared that on the file. And it doesn't happen with everyone. And that's why we see such disconnection with each other within community. And I always remind, as a mother today, we're always looking for each other. We're always looking in that place to, in a kind way, in a safe way, in a one that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable. We're looking out for each other. So some of those personal ways that I've done that through healing is through a lot of intensive child, inner child work, a lot of ceremonies, a lot of place of prayer, even feasting myself, but forgiving myself, going to treatment, taking what they call healthy risks, going back to school, even going into that positive affirmation of reuniting and loving myself, reuniting and loving my parent, and understanding that they did the best they could of raising us during the time that we were home, reuniting even with my language and the importance that I still carry with knowing that they did these horrendous things when we spoke our language in care, and reuniting to try and even speak it again, but I still carry those body memories. So I sing it. I do a lot of singing to ease that comfort of loss. I know for me, I will never get, those places of, oh, you lost your language. Oh, you lost your songs. Oh, you don't know your relations. I'll always get that. And I'm always searching for more. I believe that the truth, as they say, the truth will come back to our hearts, so that when we truth talk, we continue a new guided relationship with each other. And I thank you for this time because I get nervous when I speak about my journey. But I also ask myself, like, where else can I go? What else can I do? Because it's really important that we have these difficult conversations. And I thank each and every one of you for coming and just even insight. And I don't mean to trigger anybody. Like I speak about my journey quite openly. I spoke and I continue to speak, and that's maybe why me and my friend developed this national organization for 60 Scoop gatherings. We've done 4 successful gatherings within the region, and it became a national. And I think it's just ways that we can find each other. Before I get closed up, because I have a timer here, my wish would be also to find every place that we were buried. So it's really important we find all of us. Just like the children at residential schools, we also died while we were in care. And we really have to have that other conversation piece, because it's important that we speak of in memorial too, because I lost my brother that way. You know, I lost, there's so many different losses. So even feasting in memorial. So I give thanks, and I thank my my mother and my grandparents and all the relations. Hi.
You got your Elaine. Really appreciate taking the time and sharing your story with us. With that, I'll go to Knowledge Keeper Ed Second.
Good afternoon. Like so many of our people, we have stories that kind of interfered with our upbringing and really challenged us to be here today. For me, I was in the under the care of my grandparents out in the bush. It was great. You know, as I get older, I hear them much more clear now, as they were teaching me when I was a 3 or 4 year old boy. My mom was awesome, but she lost my dad in front of her. My dad's life was taken in front of my mom. So you can imagine if you can, or try to, what the trauma she went through. And losing my dad at an early age really affected my upbringing, because of the fact that that's when racism was introduced and that sort of stuff. And I never knew what going hungry was without food until he left, because he was a good provider. But then from there, like we were taken by Children's Aid, put in a foster home, and from there it got worse because we were shipped out to a residential school. So all those things that I've been through, all those negativities, I can honestly say to you folks that it's made me a better person today, because I learned how to be resilient, to know that I could either go that way of self-destruction or make a decision that I wanted to leave a trail or a path that would be better than mine. And at first, living with the rage and all the other negativities attached to my life, that it nearly succeeded. I became really self-destructive. And I think one of my saving graces too was I had a beautiful partner, a beautiful wife. We're still together today, you know, because of what I put my young family through. So my boy is now going to be 38 years old, or no, 40, this January 25th coming up. And it was at 9 months I decided that I would put everything together, like let go of the addictions, let go of the rage, let go of the violence. And how I did that was through ceremonial approaches. I'm really fortunate in that, because when I look at children under care and that have been gone away for a long time, there is no, whatever you want to call it, a buffer zone, a safe zone where they could gradually get back to their families and see where they're at, that sort of thing. I ran across a lot of young people during my tenure as a teacher at the college level. And let me tell you, once those kids, like they came into the system when I was at the college and they were messed up, really messed up. So, but once they got connected with their families, boy, did that make a big change, because not only they became better students, they became better people. And a lot of them have touched me, a lot of them have gone on to succeed. So, because when you lose your identity or you put it aside for a while, it confuses you, because where you come from, your roots are very important. I was fortunate in the sense that even though my late mom went through so much in her life, she instilled some values into me that I still carry today. And you got to remember, she was a residential school person too, because they took her at 6 months and did not let her go until she was 16 years old. And they did that by threatening my grandparents that they would put them in jail unless they leave my mother with them. So they didn't have much of a choice, because they had the police and all that. So, and my grandma used to tell me that was the hardest decision she ever made, crying as she paddled away from the school. And, you know, I take that as being courageous on my grandparents' part, because of the fact that they were able to do that, and it gave me a chance to live and do the things I've accomplished to date. It's been a rough road, believe me. But the fact is, I had a choice either to go in the self-destruction road or say to myself that I would make things happen, make a difference. And I'm glad I did, because the ceremonies taught me that. And one of the things, like, I think we need to see, like, you know, we always hear about young people aging out. To me, that's just an excuse for the ruling governments to try to shirk their responsibilities of something they created to begin with. And the fact that, you know, you leave these people out there and all of a sudden they're left out in the cold, it can become quite challenging. And it really contributes to the negativity of our existence. So I think if there's a vision I would have when it comes to childcare, is if we can put something in place, system in place where we can start looking after them, where they can come to, either center, you know, land-based, whatever, they can start identifying who they are and slowly make that connection back to the families and communities, because that is very important. And the thing about it is that for me, my saving grace was this great creator that was introduced to me through elders, ceremonial people. And that was introduced to me by my late granny, because she told me when I was young, because she says, the first sign of love is to listen. I never knew what that meant, but she used to tell me, you're going to know when you have your first child. And here's a lady that had 16 children, and in a matter of 5 years, she lost 14 of them due to the sickness, the diseases out there, whooping cough, TB, measles, whatever. So I never understood that. I never knew what that meant until the day my son was born. Because when he gave his first cry, his first to the world, then I saw my wife grab him and embrace him. That to me, then I realized the first sign of her love was to listen to him. Then she caressed him. And I knew what my granny meant. I knew then what she was talking about. And she taught me a lot of stuff like that. And you got to remember, I was only 3-4 years old when she was teaching me this stuff. And because during that period, like if they knew I was going to go to residential schools and I'm going to experience all those abuses that was thrown at me, I don't think they would have let me go. But that was part of my destiny, part of my journey, because now I use that, I can speak about a lot of things. The negativity at one time I couldn't. I needed the substances to exist, but now that the more ceremonies I go to, it becomes much easier to talk about it because it's letting go. And I make sure, because I'm working with youth people, young people all the time, I try to teach them, you have to let go, because if you don't, the negative stuff is just going to eat you all the time. And along the way, I've met some wonderful people. I met some wonderful grannies and wonderful grandpas, and I met some good leaders. The young people, I think today, I'm really privileged of working with because they're more savvy, they're more educated, and I think we're going to be in good hands with a lot of these people, because not only do they have the Western accreditations, but they also are beginning to build their traditional background, their traditional knowledge, their ceremonial knowledge. Very important. So this whole business, what we're trying to do today, our children, our future, we're going to get there. And I'm confident in saying that. Thank you for listening to me.
Miigwech, Elder. I mean, I like how you're now in a position of sharing that knowledge and that you've gained over those multiple years, and speaking about your journey and how you're slowly letting go of the negative. I mean, I'm sure that plenty of our audience out there are on that journey. So Miigwech, Elder. Erickson, I believe, has a presentation for everyone. So we'll go to Erickson's presentation or video.
Bonjour, my name is Erickson Owen, Ndonji Opusati Kang, Ingnin Daya Most Clan, Miwan and Dodam, Nishna Peshka, Swapskima Ingan, Miigwech Kiki, Wijam Goyan, much bewitched to Yan Worka, we Sigma. Yaki Miigwech the Nakikchai Akshko, Pakanaka Wikakitu, be wheat Pimikuinke, we know. Hello, my name is Erickson Owen. I am from Poplar Hill First Nation. I am from the Moose Clan. It is my totem. My spiritual name is White Wolf. I want to give thanks for being invited and for being allowed to be a part of this important event. I want to thank the elders and other panelists for joining us. And now I will give a brief introduction, just a short story of my life. I have been invited here to talk about the Child and Family Services system because I myself was in foster care for a big part of my childhood. The organization I was in was called Tikanagan, which is situated in Red Lake, Ontario. I was taken into care back in 2009 during the summer. During that time I was told it would only be for a few weeks, but those 2 weeks turned into 5 years. I had my brother Eric with me, thankfully, and many relatives who I visited frequently. I had to become my own parent at that time. I told myself at the beginning that I could sit there and cry all the time, or I could focus on the one thing that I am good at. That is school. I was already the best in class during that time, even before I was taken into care, and I chose to focus on that more and more. I was blessed to be in a good home with my uncle. I was in the system for about 5 years, but my file was not closed until March 2019 when I turned 21, because I was put on something called Independent Living Allowance, which gave Tikanagan permission to contact me monthly to see how I am doing, and I also got some financial support from them monthly. It was about $850 a month. The contract stood so long as I was in school or in a job. That's just a brief story of my life. Now I'll get into some things I wanted to bring up thanks to this opportunity. I want to share some advice, insights, and visions for the future of child and family services. For the future of child and family services, I hope to see the system focus more on helping families stay together instead of giving up on the family and keeping the children until they grow out of the CFS system. If the parents have too much trouble with taking care of their children, the company should assist them in finding help for anything like alcohol addictions, rehab, mental health services to make themselves better and capable of taking care of their children and getting those kids back to them. These parents could then be assessed by community leadership and the CFS system to determine if they are ready to have the kids back before they close the book on reuniting the family. Family staying together should always be the main priority unless it's absolutely positively necessary to take them away. I stress this because many children who come out of the system come out with many personal problems such as trauma, drug, and alcohol addictions. They are sometimes suicidal even. It is just a big negative thing that will make someone unwell throughout their life. They could also try to keep the children in their community as much as possible if they are taken instead of being taken to a foreign city or reservation where that child is not familiar with. Some children who are in communities with Ojibwe being the first language often come back only speaking English because the places where they went to, they were laughed at whenever they spoke in Ojibwe. Whenever they spoke to family over the phone, they would be met with giggles and laughter in the background. This trauma lives on even when they come back. And I have met a few people like that whenever I know they know the language, and I asked them if we could talk in Ojibwe, and they always say they are afraid of me laughing at them, which is bizarre because I like seeing people speak in their language with passion. If we keep them where they are, they will not have to lose their language or culture and confidence to practice it. If they are taken out, CFS should make sure they are put somewhere where their culture, language, and feelings are respected and supported. An elder told me a story before I'm going to share here. Back in their time, long ago, if a young man or woman had a son or daughter they were not ready to have and did not want, someone else in their family would take that child into their care like a relative. Back then, the community really took care of each other. If one person was struggling, they would carry that person shoulder to shoulder. If you help one person, you help everyone. And next, I will talk about what First Nations control over CFS will mean for future generations of children. First Nations control over CFS to me means First Nations people deciding when it is necessary for a child to be taken into care and out of town if possible. I see us creating a nice system that will protect a First Nation child's identity because our culture, language, and beliefs are a big part of First Nations identity, and it must be protected today, tomorrow, and always. Moving past that, and now I'm going to talk about what supports are needed as the youth exit the care system. Many youth, when exiting the care system, develop personal problems such as mental health, depression, suicide ideation, drug addictions, and alcohol addictions. It would be very helpful if the CFS system could guide the youth to these services that cover these issues to ensure their well-being is taken care of and for their future. It would also be nice if the organizations could make sure these youth are someplace safe with family before they cut ties with that person. Financial support is also a big thing that is needed when youth are coming out of care because they are not just going to magically find a job that covers all their needs or even a job at all. It's very difficult. It would be very helpful to them if they could get funding to give them monthly allowance until they are 21, like Tiknagan do. It could vary depending if they are living on reserve or in the city by themselves. On reserve, about $1,200 a month would be enough to sustain one person's needs each month because they live with family and support each other. In the city, it is very different, and the risk of homelessness is very high. Living in the city would require at least $2,200 a month to cover apartment bills and food. These would be very helpful to help the youth transition into good jobs. They have to get through college and find work before they can get these things. Before they exit the system, it would also be good if they were educated and taught on basic living skills such as apartment hunting, job hunting, resume writing, budgeting, and financial tips. Also how to live in the city, like commuting, map reading, and basic stuff like that to make sure they are and will be good members of society. They also need to do their driver's test so they have their G license by the time they are out of the system. It would be nice if these needs were met before they go off on their own. And lastly, that's about all I have to say. I want to once again thank the organizers for inviting me here, and it was an honor to share my story and ideas and to be a part of this big picture, which I hope will turn into something big to help future generations. I want to thank again the elders and the other panelists, Miwe and Miigwech. That's all, and thank you.
Sorry. That was almost like it was recorded. It was like perfect timing. It was exactly 10 minutes. Thank you very much, Eric. I don't know if you want to add anything after your video.
Yeah, I just want to say again that I'm very grateful to be here, to be among these great people, the elders, and I hope the other panelists will show up soon as well. And I'm very excited to answer some questions as well, if anyone has any. And I want to say thank you for coming. And all right. Yeah.
Thank you, Erickson. I have no questions from participants out there yet, so do try practicing sending us your questions to the email so we can get some questions. I do have a question though. We did hear a little bit, Erickson, you did speak a little bit about what supports you think youth should have as they're moving out. You had about 4 or 5 suggestions there. I thought they were fantastic suggestions. Are there anything else, or like, did we talk about the supports? You talked about the allowance, you talked about the driver's license, you talked about, you know, some life skills that they're living in the city, living away from the city. My curiosity, me being the policy wonka, you know, if you say that on reserve you get so much, and off reserve you get so much, will everyone leave the reserve? I'm just that's my because it'd be if oh hey wait, I can move to the city and get $400 more, but then it costs $600 more to live in the city, right? So that's the challenge you have. So I'm thinking about those life skills, right? Some people might say, oh no, I'll get more money in the city, but not realize how much more expensive it is to live in the city than it is to live at home. So how can First Nations leadership perhaps support those kinds of initiatives? So I put that to the panel. We had some suggestions from Erickson. What would be messages you have for the leadership out there in terms of trying to get those supports in place? So I'll leave it to the panelists in terms of your thoughts. Or Erickson, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Sure.
I think it's very important that we have these services in place because as I said before, when a child ages out of the system, they have almost no services. They are left to fend for themselves, basically. I think it's important that they are supported as much as possible for as long as, until they're at least 21, as I said. I think that's enough time for them to have enough experience to start finding jobs and have enough of an education to get a nice job to sustain their needs. So,
I'm just thinking about, you know, where I was at between age 18 and 21 in terms of even my mindset and being mature enough, you know, to go get a job. So I'm wondering about those age things. Elaine, do you have any thoughts or Ed in terms of, you know, 21, or is it, you know, depending on who you are? I'm thinking about different, you know, children in their lives in terms of even their, you know, not everyone's ready at 21. Not everyone's ready at, and some are ready at 16, right? So maybe I don't know, any thoughts on it?
I think one of the, to echo the young man's thought about life skills. In our community here, we're quite fortunate to have the bush right 2-3 minutes away. And the fact is, though, like the community has taken the stance that there would be no apprehension of children leaving the community. And, I think they've lived up to it to their best of their can, but what the biggest issue is the funding. The funding is not there to support the First Nations, because if we're going to go to life skills and we take them out here and out in the bush to learn their tea, it does take funding. And that's the thing that I don't really cannot comprehend when the federal, provincial people said we don't have it. And yet when they took our children, we were a big business. Childcare among Aboriginal people being upright is a big business. We are. Now, I think what they should be saying to themselves, okay, we're pouring all this money in to take them out, and when it's over, there's nothing to sort of ease them back in, and that creates a lot of problems. That's where the problems of identity, we have to, I think, really look at that, because of the fact the funding is really does not equal what's out there in the urban cities, whatever. It's just not equal. It doesn't equal to what they put out in their own society, because of the fact that they can't comprehend our way. For up here, transportation is a big issue. It's a huge issue. It costs. So then one day, the cost of living standards is higher up here too. Food, petrol, that sort of thing. They have to recognize that, and yet when they try to fund something, they're using the Southern mentality, and it just doesn't work, because the reality of our situation is being isolated and distancing, and also transportation is a huge issue. So I think funding is probably an important aspect to all what we want to do.
Elaine, any thoughts?
Hi. I think it's that ongoing conversation of how present funding is inadequate. Present funding is inadequate related to whether the child stays on reserve or off reserve. Like, I can only speak a lot of, and that's that importance of customary care agreements within the community and band, having customary care representatives, kind of like how we already have child welfare representatives on the band, to also engage within child welfare workers through INAC, or the additional funding needed, and recognizing the inadequacy of the on reserve, off reserve mentality. A child is a child that has been apprehended from the community. And the importance that of community level to gather a cooperative approach when a family or a child's been identified, like a prevention approach, a continuum approach, an aftercare, a continuum aftercare approach. And just like Ed mentioned, and also the nice youth, Owen or Erickson, sorry, related to the ongoing conversation about the loss of identity. How to engage the individual, family, child back within identity level. And like, for me, if it hadn't been through the Friendship Center when I was 7 years old, and Cree women coming up to my little Ukrainian mom saying, "You have a Cree girl, we have to take her to the Friendship Center." Like, if it hadn't been for that, I would not have known that there was a community out there, or nation out there, and even kids, because, you know, the era that I was apprehended in, we were so isolated. Like, I was in the suburbs, like I didn't see any Indigenous kids. Like, the only time I saw them is when we went downtown Saskatoon, and a majority of the time at the Army and Navy, it's because they were homeless. But that disengagement related to that could be my relative, you know, and if the Friendship Center is getting funding, then access, because the reality is we've been written about a long time. There's files that are written about, so it's really engaging with the present child welfare system that says, okay, if you're going to do better, because you get better funding, we have to talk about the funding inadequacies of on reserve, off reserve, Indigenous child welfare to just child welfare, the national conversation. And why aren't you, and calling them out, right? Like if chief and council and community are saying, if we're going to say that we speak for youth and look to the next generation as the leaders, then we are the present leaders of child welfare, because we've been through these different elements, kind of like where we honored and still speak of how Indian residential school have affected our families, day schools have affected our families, Indian hospitals, like the ongoing place of this huge umbrella of resiliency, this huge umbrella of strength that we all carry. But then it becomes like a larger cover to us, but we can move it as a cover into a blanket to help warm each other in a good way, to bring us and that's that attachment. What does bring us home really mean? What does bringing us home, like that heart home, that safety home, that relationship, that going forward, and non-Indigenous also need to be a part of that. You know, like that's why the TRC and the RCAP report, they all wrote about child welfare. Like if you go back to the RCAP report, they wrote about it. The Cindy Blackstocks, they wrote about it. So it's already been written. The Sinclair report, it's already been written. So those are the other conversations of, you need to also have this already in your educating to be a social worker, educating upon hiring. This must be the mandate of your cultural contract to the communities, because we traveled everywhere. Like I traveled from Manitoba to Saskatchewan to Ontario. And in there, I traveled with my adoptive family all the way to Africa as I was raised, until I became homeless and I ran away from that home. And I was homeless between 17 and 21. There was no consistency. So that's that other larger conversation of, how did we actually get through? And so I don't wish that upon anyone, to go through what I went through, because of the hardship and the addictions and the loss. So I hope going forward, we unearth better ways to take care of children in care, and the present children that are coming out of care.
There's one comment, Erickson, you made that when you were first taking him to care and you were there with your brother, and you said that you focused on your strength. You were able to find what your strength was, and you said that was school. And you focused your energy on that school. I'm wondering, because I mean, that's something that not everyone would do, right? It's not something that everyone would say, what is my strength? Who am I? And where do I focus my energies? So I'm just wondering, have you thought about how do we get the children who are in care to see their strength, or to recognize their strengths and work towards them? Any thoughts? Because I mean, I thought that's a brilliant survival skill, right? What am I really good at, and how can I focus my energy on that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's what happened when I was taken into care. I wanted to focus on one thing only, and that's one of the major things I was very good at was in school. Like I would always be the first one to finish all his assignments before everyone else, and then afterwards I would be reading a book and doing other things or playing around, you know. Yeah, so if you're ever in that position, you should think about focusing on yourself, like find out like what is one thing you're very good at, and then you just take that and you hone that skill, you cure it, like try to cure it as much as possible, make it sharp. And that's what I did. Well, for me, it was education, and for you, it could be something else. Like it could be sports, could be singing, fashion, writing, or reading. It could be anything, as long as it's a good thing. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just thinking about, you know, how you were talking about supporting families, right? That whole prevention piece, that whole idea of making sure that when, you know, whatever the child is living through, or in terms of being in care, that at the end they're stronger, or they're in a good position to, you know, be self-determined in terms of their own aspirations. I guess I'm trying to think of, are there strategies to strengthen families, you know, of course, before their children are taken into care, but also those who take kids into care, to help them, you know, with the children they have, to provide that opportunity that you said, you know, to say, let's discover your strength, right? Maybe it's through connection, you know, perhaps it's through the Friendship Center, or perhaps it's through like a land-based organization, like perhaps what Ed's talking about. But how do you support those families pre, and then, you know, while, on those who have children in care, right? Like Elaine said, just by accident, they bump into people from the Friendship Center and say, well, no, you have to bring your Cree child to come visit us. That was an accident. But how do we make that part of, you know, the system to ensure that there's not this huge learning curve about reconnecting at the end, right? How do we support those families who are caring for children to make sure that connection is happening while they're in care? Any thoughts?
All right. Before they're taken into care, as I said before, they should try to focus on keeping the families together. And in order to do that, they should just start by monitoring the family, making sure they're okay, they're not doing bad stuff like drinking or domestic abuse, stuff like that, and just keeping communication, keeping it strong, just talking your way through. And because when someone's family kids are taken away, that's when they start to bargain, like, I won't do this again. You know, they should remind them that this might happen. Their kids might get taken. They should start to act now, so that way they won't have that regret if their kids are taken. They won't think that maybe I shouldn't have drank, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And that way we should just continue to encourage them. They need lots of encouragement. And after they're taken away, in order to make sure that their beliefs and language and culture are protected, they should be placed in a home where that family they receive training in respecting and encouraging the child's beliefs, language, and culture. And they should have materials provided for them in case they want to practice their culture, like smudging or traditional dancing, stuff like that, like dress wear, stuff like that. And maybe some language books as well, Ojibwe dictionaries, things like that.
Thank you very much. I noticed we have Cheyenne. She showed up. So we only have a little under 10 minutes, Cheyenne, but I know that Elaine, you put up cultural contracts as perhaps something. Maybe we'll explore that. But let's go right to Cheyenne. Give us her presentation, and hopefully we'll have time to get right through it, Cheyenne, and then we'll open the floor again if possible. So go ahead, Cheyenne, all yours.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to start off here with recommendations to better serve our children and youth. I had them all bullet point formed here, but I'll just start off by the first one. I will start with extending the time period in care past age of 18. Workers and individuals such as myself advocated to be as high as 25. Of course, with the consent of the youth. to also allow for supports and services to be in place that will assist young adults in transitioning into independence, to also increase the higher chance of their success. Many of the homeless are transit people here in Winnipeg have aged out of care with no supports to ensure that they could transition into and maintain adulthood successfully. This means that they will suffer more and sleep rough, couch surf, use homeless shelters, or even risk becoming sexually exploited in return for shelter and food and other necessities. We would not transition our own children into adulthood without making sure that they can take care of themselves, right? So why are we doing this to Indigenous children in care? As part of the extension of time period would be to start the transition planning with the youth much earlier. By the age of 14, you should be actively learning the skills needed to become independent young adults. And in Manitoba here, the transitional planning begins prior to a youth aging out of care, leaving limited time for them to acquire the useful life skills and prevent them from building the confidence to take care of themselves. The best thing for our youth is to provide extension support past the age of 18. This would also require dedicated transition workers to assist our youth on preparing them for young adulthood from an earlier age. I also suggest that doing so should not have limitations on eligibility on who gets the support. Anyone should get it. Housing and homelessness is a major concern. The other thing that could be done is providing housing for youth transitioning out of care, whether or not they're part of an independent living program. Housing security is mental health and suicide prevention, no matter what your background is. We also need better addiction and mental health services for youth in care who are transitioning out of care. Services that work in tandem with each other and that meet the youth where they are in their lives. Currently, the services are very disjointed, and it is exceptionally difficult to get mental health services if you're a youth in care, especially if you're in a crisis. Another important action is to ensure that children and youth are connected to their community culture and language. This is a major one too. Because knowing who you are, where you come from tells us that we belong somewhere and to someone. Feeling alone is the hallmark of being a child in care. So to know that you have extended family, a community that you belong to, can be a lifesaver for our Indigenous youth. Another thing that it brings me towards is another bullet point that I have here. Just some topics that continue to be an issue within the child welfare today. These also include staff turnovers. This is a struggle as the child is unable to develop relationships with their worker, and it creates a sense of dissociation towards all things related to child and family services. The worker is the first person to create that ambiance of safety and the first person to consistently show that they care. If not, then it feeds that traumatic ripple that the child is experiencing. This also brings us to family connections again. The agencies are unable to keep connections with the biological family. The interaction between kinship and the agency should be granted and enforced to ensure that the connection is, previously there, that we previously spoke about. The other one would be lack of proper case management and planning with the child. This also perpetuates the need of the child to not be met in a timely manner by all levels of the system and feeds that narrative that the system fails the child. Better could be done here. The other one is lack of support from the agency. This is just an extension of what I just previously stated with the lack of proper case management. Lastly would be reunification. The question goes has it ever been attempted or even considered? But as we move forward to create a better future for our youth and to ensure the decrease in number of apprehensions, these pinpoints, I hope that everyone at least takes note of these recommendations and these topics. And I do encourage you to lay them down within your meetings and your decisions and your designs, because these are very important. But that basically wraps up my presentation for you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheyenne. You don't hear it, but there's a huge amount of applause out there. So a couple of questions that came to us through the World Wide Web. So what is the single most important subject that we as chiefs need to advocate for in exercising our own laws for our children and families? I think Ed, I'll just note here, Ed in the chat has said incorporating our traditional teachings in the child system, not just the Western way of child upbringing, is important. Proper, respectful, and true Aboriginal delivery based on our cultures and systems. Any thoughts in terms of what's the key message if you are a chief out there advocating for your own systems? What would be that key message? I'll Cheyenne, seeing that we'll start with you.
Well, key thing would be to take in consideration all of the levels that it takes to, properly take care of a child. It isn't just one section of you guys. It takes a whole tree of us in order to bring about this change that we all need. Even in the thought process, to be able to, bring that change much needed for the children, the community, it deals with having to look inside you, put yourself in the shoes of the children and their families. What exactly is the things that are going on in their lives that, push them towards this? And
the historical context, right? The historical context, who they are, where they come from.
Yes. Looking into traditional ways of seeing things, perspectives, Yeah.
Ed, any thoughts on the key area, what you would say was the biggest priority? And you're also on mute, just a little heads up.
I think one of the things we need to look at is housing for families on our First Nations. I heard about homelessness in the urban setting, which is true and quite tragic. But on the First Nations, we also have several homeless people. For example, if you go in a 3-bedroom house and they have 15 to 25 people living in it, so that translates maybe perhaps 2 or 3 families living together. And we've seen that through the COVID and what we went through, because when food was distributed, they said 1 per house. Well, if one house has 20 people, it doesn't really serve them well. If a house had 4 or 5 people, because they're just that family, then it helps. Even with funding, like they gave $300 in some First Nations to families, but to each house, that's how they define it. To each household, we're going to give $300. But when that house carries 20 people, that $300 is not going to go very far. So I think the chief should let the government people know to do their proper data, to be honest when they start doing these programming. And housing is number 1. It's like that both on and off. But the fact is, if we have to have control of our education, so that way we can prop up the child care services run by our own people. That's what needs to be done, is the education of our people, so they can take the responsibilities of delivering and manage good child care services. I know that's a lot, but that's my opinion on it. Thank you.
Gretchen, we're all coming to the end of our time. What I'd like to do is Erickson and Elaine, perhaps one thing you would like to, a message you would have to leadership when it comes to advocacy. Erickson.
Yes. The key thing for me I would recommend for the chiefs to focus on is one of my ideas in my videos would be keeping families together as at whatever the cost, because if you keep the families together, a childhood won't have to be taken away from them. They'll be able to live in their family homes with their family all throughout their childhood. They won't have to be somewhere foreign where they don't know, they won't have to become their own parent at such a young age. They can just be a child up until they're adults, because
So they're 50. Miigwech Erickson, thank you. Perfect. Elaine, last thoughts to you.
Sometimes when we're over 50, we still feel like a kid.
Exactly.
Kind of like the advocacy we've been doing for residential school survivors in Indian hospitals. It's the equivalent advocacy for us that went previous relations that were in care, because there's still that concept or that thinking, we haven't found all of us. We're not all home. It's really important to understand that there's still, like, it's not just one grief, it's like complex, consistent grief that's been there. So even having a memorial site for where we go to place it somewhere, to feast that place, to honor the families, and also like even take off the shame, right? There's that always that ongoing, like, oh, you were in child welfare, oh, you're a foster kid, oh, you were, like, all these different labels that I talked about earlier. It's not our shame. We were just kids. It's not our family's shame. They were struggling. It's not our grandparents' shame. So it's really, really coming into that place of we're having an equal balance to bring you home because we love you. That's that ongoing space. And I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, that's a perfectly beautiful way to end this segment, Elaine. That is awesome thoughts. Thank you very much. I want to thank Elaine for their participation. Erickson, for your video was awesome, right on time. I want to thank Ed Miigwech, Ed, for your opening our sessions and your thoughts and sharing your story. And Cheyenne, thank you for joining us. Never too late to join us. So Miigwech, for that, thank you for your sharing your story. And I like how you went right to what you needed to be said and right to your recommendations. So that's perfect. Miigwech, everyone, I assure you that the hundreds and hundreds of people out there are applauding you in terms of your presentation. So Miigwech, everyone, take care, and we'll move on to our next agenda item. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe out there. Our next presenter, sitting in the wings there waiting for us to come on live, is Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who is going to speak to us a little bit, who's our keynote speaker. Will give us a little overview, background overview, and updates on the act itself. So we'll have Ms. Turpel-Lafond speak to us, and then afterwards I'll open the floor once again for comments. I'm starting to get the emails, I'm starting to get the chats and the messages of questions, so keep it up. That way I know I'm not sitting here by myself. So keep the questions coming in, and with that, we'll jump right into our next agenda item, which is with our guest keynote's address, a background overview and updates on the act. So Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew, for that introduction. And first of all, just say good morning to friends and relatives, and just say that I'm zooming into the webinar today to our virtual circle from Wasanich People's Territory, Vancouver Island. So it's still morning here, but just say good morning to everyone. And I have a presentation and a PowerPoint that we're going to walk through, and it is available for you if you want to see it and if you need some additional information. I want to acknowledge the prayer to open the session and the good words that have come in the sessions that just preceded this. I enjoyed listening, and so many of the key messages that have come out today really speak to the moment that we're in, which is one of change. And as Indigenous people and as First Nations people, how important it has been over the last number of years to pull together, to stand up very strongly for our children and families, and to also be active in the business and the activity around nation building and making sure that we are returning authority for children and families back to First Nations governments, and keeping First Nations children in First Nations families. These are really important principles, and Regional Chief Hart spoke to them this morning. And he has he's been very committed and involved in this work for a long time. And I've just been so honored and privileged over the last number of years to work with the chiefs and the Chiefs Committee that informed the legislation that's now this federal act for First Nations children and families, and the process that we've been in to change. And it's taken a lot of different paths. A single piece of legislation doesn't change everything. And as we heard from all of the voices today, there's a lot of work to be done to honor, to address the legacy, to honor the voices of First Nations children and youth that are in the system, to make sure that they're heard and that they're welcomed, and we rebuild bridges. There's been a lot of damage done by the colonial system to Indigenous families and communities, and we're repairing that actively. And we are in a position, after a lot of fighting, a lot of court cases and fighting and debating, to actually have more support from Canada than we've had in the past. So the presentation I'm going to give is going to just really be focused on giving you background about the new legislation. Where is it? What are the things that we're thinking about in community? I work with my own community. I work with a number of First Nations communities where we're directly building the new system that will take full control back from the child welfare system. I wanted to note that although we're only 1 year into implementing this new legislation, and we've been through a pandemic, we're going through a very challenging pandemic. So there have been issues that have made it very difficult for our families and our communities. It's a very tough time where we can't be together, because at all times we need to strengthen our relationships to do this work. But what I'm excited about is the fact that despite all of that, there has been significant effort by First Nations across Canada to take back authority for child and family services. And that is showing up in a lot of different ways. At least 23 First Nations or First Nations groups, like for instance, Treaty 2 in Manitoba, and others have notified the minister that this change is going to happen. And where are they? What are they doing? What can we learn from what's been happening so far? And how can we support the listeners who are in First Nations communities, First Nations leadership, from a staff level, from an elected level, from the perspective of elders, youth, and others? How do we support you to do this important work? So I'm going to turn to the PowerPoint. I'm going to walk you through that. Hopefully you'll have a chance to ask any questions that you might have, and I can kind of assist with this. So just you can see that if we can just fill the screen with the PowerPoint, that would be great. Thank you very much. And that's excellent. So first of all, what changed a year ago? Let's talk about what has changed in terms of child and family services. After a lot of debates pushing, the law came into effect on January 1, so just a little bit more than a year ago, that did a few things. It affirmed that the inherent rights of First Nations include an affirmation that includes the rights of our First Nations governments to have full control over child and family services. And by that, it means authority to enact our own laws, to put in place our own policies, to put in place our own process for dispute resolution, and to set up good relationships with child welfare agencies to begin to get the children's files identified, get the children's cases returned, to do the legacy work, but also to shift things on an ongoing basis. So this is quite significant. And now, as you can see in that first slide, what are some of the other big things is it also brought into place some national standards. So while this work was happening, it changed the standards that apply to Indigenous children and families and First Nations children and families. Now, a year in, there have been court decisions and other things, and issues are coming around. There has been some progress. The progress, as I said, has been a bit impacted by the pandemic, And also, of course, we all get very concerned about the well-being of children and families during the pandemic as they're isolated. So a lot of children and families where we were working in the system to get the cases out of the system, some of them, these cases have been slowed down by the pandemic. So we have to be mindful of that. But it's important to note that there are new national standards, and I'm going to talk about them, and I'm going to address what they are. And today, and in the next number of webinars that we have, we're also going to be addressing this. And I really do want to give a shout out to the Assembly of First Nations and the staff and the chiefs and others for putting together this series of webinars, because it is going to have some really valuable information for you to draw down on as we try to find the best way during this pandemic to support each other. Okay, so this next slide is really, it's a pictogram. It's a way of thinking about what has changed. And I'm going to use this a couple of times, and it's really important to see how it works. At the middle of the circle is the best interest of the child, reconsidered from a First Nations viewpoint. As you know, through history, the best interest of the child has been used as an instrument, as a concept or doctrine in the provincial child welfare systems to remove kids, to say it's not in the best interest of First Nations kids to be with their families because of all of this sort of racism and prejudice that we've experienced for a long time. However, the new legislation has done something which is reframed the best interest of the child. So it's no longer in that negative place, and it brings with certain new things with it. So inside that circle of what is the best interest of the child is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which we know has very important protections and provisions around, for instance, Article 8, preventing the transfer of children from one people to another, like we saw with the 60 Scoop, etc. So these really important rights. So best interest is no longer about the removal. The best interest is about keeping children with community. The legislation also recognized and upheld the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And I say that because the issues of racism, systemic racism, individual racism, prejudice, and discrimination have been through the entire child welfare system. And we're talking a lot about that in terms of the healthcare system. We continue to be cleaning up and addressing the legacy of that racism. And so it's important that the legislation shifts based on human rights principles and gives us some space to talk about that discrimination that has been experienced. And I'll talk later a bit about birth alerts and how this continues to be an issue, why so much advocacy went into the new legislation to end birth alerts. They haven't been ended everywhere. We still are dealing with the legacy, but why that was so racially discriminatory and so prejudicial to First Nations families in terms of seeking healthcare and seeking support for children. So best interest of the child needs to change. To the right-hand side, you'll see something called special circumstances on that slide. What are the things, and again, in the middle, I just would say we have Jordan's principle, very significant that children do not have jurisdictional barriers to get their needs. We affirm that children need to be heard, they need to participate in the process, and we're so lucky to have that panel we just had on the elders and the youth. We need to do more of that, lifting up the youth. We need to do more of developing youth advisory and input into our process. Also, sibling relationships are to be respected and upheld using First Nations concepts. First Nations concepts of the family are to be upheld. And this reframing of best interest of the child is important because it also allows for First Nations, specific First Nations values and beliefs about how children should be connected. And of course, we are not a one size fits all. All Indigenous people have the same views. We have different practices, we have different laws, we have different ways to uphold and support our kinship. And the law that has shifted is now coming to say we want to respect, we want to go to where you are, respect and support your process. So on the right-hand side are special circumstances. What is the purpose of all of this? Right? So laws exist for a purpose. What is the purpose of all of our work? You can see the most important purpose: reduce the number of children in care, reduce the number of First Nations children in stranger foster care, get children back to family and their nation, that children need extra support. Children should not be removed because of poverty, substandard housing, health issues, need to access services in their own community. As I said, we need to end birth alerts and end these very corrosive, discriminatory practices. On the left-hand side of that circle, you see it talks about critical tools. What are the new tools in this legislation? While we're developing our legal systems, our norms, our policies, our new system, new tools are there right away. So these things, they don't have to wait. We can change what they are. We can make them align more consistently with our own tribal practices and laws. But in the meantime, what's there? These are very important as pushbacks on the provincial child welfare systems that have caused so much damage to First Nations. So first of all, it's the priority on placement. Indigenous First Nations children have a right to be placed with their family. And if there isn't their immediate family, their extended family, another family in their nation, and only as a last resort, another family. So the priority on placement has completely shifted. And we know how important that was because we know that it was not possible to get children placed with family and community in the past. What is also significant in terms of the new tools is this giving full faith and credit to First Nations laws as we develop them, put them in place, and that they have paramountcy over the provincial system. Other key tools in this legislation are, well, you'll see no mention in this legislation of the Indian Act for a reason. The chiefs have been very clear, communities have been very clear. We do not want to rehabilitate this broken, flawed Indian Act. So everything in this legislation is based on First Nations authority, jurisdiction, and decisions, taking a self-determination approach guided more by the UN Declaration and inherent rights. It is not about an Indian Act bylaw. In the past, nations have had to rely on Indian Act bylaws because it was the only tool. This is no longer the case. Now we have a whole new set of tools, and we have a set of obligations that if the nation, if you want to exercise your authority in children and families, you can ask and bring others to the table where they will have to coordinate with you. That doesn't mean that they have to recognize and agree to, they have to coordinate their work with your authority. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in this presentation. So moving forward to the next slide, just back one, I just want to talk a little bit about these national principles, quite apart from the authority. Just think of these three concepts. We're going to talk about them a lot, not just today, but in the future sessions. Best interests of the Indigenous child, best interests of the First Nations child, reconsidered according to First Nations values. All of the new standards and tools are there. The old way of doing things is not to continue to be applied to First Nations children and families. And if you're still fighting that and seeing that in the system, you're still butting up against that negative control, command control approach by the provincial systems, that shaming and blaming of First Nations children and families around you can't meet the best interests of your children. That has to be pushed back on very hard from an advocacy level and from a leadership level, and there's tools there. Secondly is cultural continuity. It's important that First Nations children be connected to their communities, be connected to their nations, be connected to their families. That's a right that the child has. That's a right that the family has. That is a right that the nation has. And it's something that Canada respects and recognizes finally, which was a very important recommendation coming from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was to recognize cultural continuity. Transmitting language, culture, identity, and being connected to family is a safe place for a child, and that has to be upheld as a principle. And what we've seen, and for some of us who have worked in child welfare for many years, like myself, had a lot of cases, you know, we still have to fight against the fact that in the non-Indigenous system, when First Nations children were taken, they'd say, oh, well, we're exposing them to First Nations culture. And, you know, maybe the child was Haida and they were being exposed in downtown Winnipeg to some Anishinaabe culture, or sometimes it was as trite as, you know, a velvet painting of an Indian and a horse in the house. It wasn't real culture. It wasn't really being connected to identity, language, family. And so the resurgence that this legislation brings is the resurgence of Indigenous and First Nations identity and language. Children have a right to be connected to their actual nation, not the pan-Indian one-size-fits-all kind of like work that's been going on for years that has been promoted as Indigenous in these systems when it is nothing to do with First Nations relationships, control, or respect for our nations and our identity. And that has really got to be emphasized. This is about serious work where community is. And the national standards that have been created in the legislation, right? They're minimum standards, okay? So how, like on cultural continuity, how do we keep the kids connected? Well, there are new provisions requiring notice to a parent, a caregiver, and an Indigenous governing body before any measure is taken for a child. I want to talk about what is an Indigenous governing body. In the legislation, this word IGB, we call it, Indigenous Governing Body, is used. It sounds like an awkward word, I know, but it was because we wanted to be clear that this is not just a band council authority under the Indian Act. An Indigenous governing body is how a First Nation can form its own government. So we are going through transitions. Band council governments are not the only government. We have new governments that are more approved and accepted by the nation. They may involve kinship councils, hereditary systems, etc. So it's very open to how First Nations, through self-determination, select the government. So an Indigenous governing body has got to get notice. Now, this is quite important because the child welfare system has been based on removing children and actually never telling you where they are. Once children go down, we call it like the rabbit hole of child welfare, they're out of the hands of the family. It's very hard to get them back. And many of us have worked years to try and reunite families with children and know how hard it is to get not just notice, to find out where is a child, what's happening with the child. Many First Nations in Canada, as we know, many of you listening will know, we know there's children, they're not registered to our nations. Sometimes, there's no unstated paternity. We're not really sure where they are. We might get a phone call about them out of the blue, or more often than not, we don't find out anything. So this new legislation is about, you now have to give notice, right? So in the first year, how is that working? That's coming out slowly because this is a very different thing for the provincial systems. Provincial systems do not notify people. They keep information quiet. So provincial systems having to work with First Nations governments is a new and improved situation, but it's going to take some time to get this meaningfully done. And we need to continue to monitor how often are they giving notice in each of your jurisdictions, like for your own children. Are you getting notice of a significant measure? What is a significant measure you should hear about? What the chiefs have said and what First Nations advisors and leaders have said is, if a child is in care, is changing a residence, is changing a school, we need to be notified, we need to get involved, plan, and look at every opportunity to reconsider the placement of that child and get them out of the system. So these are the things you should be hearing about. Again, you'll note that it says here that prevention is to be a priority. That means not intervening and removing, but preventing removal. So very significant to note that. So these are some of the new standards that are there. They're not things you have to argue for. The arguing's finished. They're there. They're tools you need to be drawing down and using when you're working with the system. You have backup, you have support, when in the past you did not have backup and support. So again, thinking about these national standards and national principles, how do they interrelate with our own First Nations values and practices? Well, these were protections and rights based. They were very much informed by the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, very much informed by the work of the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women's Commission. Even though it hadn't released the report, they'd done a lot of work on child and families and had some very powerful things to say. So these principles are there. So notice, as I said, that's section 12. I'm just going to refer to a few of the key sections of the legislation. And we don't have a chance today to go through the legislation, but it's very important to read it. We're going to spend more time on it. There are 10 preambular provisions in that legislation. Preambles in federal legislation do have meaning. They're significant. That does refer to things like TRC. It does refer to ending discrimination and racial discrimination. And there's 35 sections in the Act. So 10 preambular sections, 35 sections. Very important to get to know it. You don't have to have a lawyer, but you do need to read it and understand it. And that's partially what some of our presentation today will be at, and some of our papers and materials that are available to you. So what are these other sections? So section 15, children cannot be removed due to poverty, ill health, or lack of services to parents or caregivers. Section 14, priority on prevention. You do not remove or apprehend, you prevent the situation that puts the child in jeopardy. And we know in some First Nations, in, for instance, Manitoba and elsewhere, they have pioneered for some time an approach which is you actually take the entire family into care. You don't just remove the child. And so those approaches are valid and they're legitimate approaches. Again, the placement priority, I've talked about it. Here we make a note about birth alerts again, and I just want to make a note of section 14 of the legislation. Former Minister of Indigenous Services, Minister Jane Philpott, Dr. Jane Philpott, was the minister at the time the legislation was being developed. She had a very good understanding, having been a physician. She's now the dean at Queen's University, the dean of health professions. She had a very good understanding of how birth alerts, where you took children at birth. So a birth alert is where the hospital is notified that a First Nations mom will deliver. They put an alert in the system that they're to remove the child. There's no one that works with mom or family. It's an alert. So at birth, the child's removed instantly. Huge, one of the most traumatic, toxic, harmful experiences. We are still recovering from it. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of birth alerts. And as they've been stopped, since this legislation has come into effect, as I said earlier, that information is still in the healthcare system. And I know myself from working quite a bit with people navigating health services, that they continue to feel like that racism and prejudice against them when they had a birth alert still sits on their health file, and it causes problems with them getting the needed health services that they require. So birth alerts need to end with this legislation. They were already illegal. They were already inappropriate. The legislation is a very strong support in your back pocket to end them. We're going to hear a lot more about them. I know our regional chief Hart talked about it. This is an area where there's continuing harm. We're unpackaging the continuing harm, and we need to keep addressing this. Next piece I wanted to talk about is what kind of definitions are in this legislation. Like, one of the challenges we frequently faced is, for Indigenous families and for First Nations families, like, who's a family? Like, our concepts of our cousins are like our siblings. What is our family construct? For a long time, that nuclear Western family has driven that child welfare system to chop people up and say, oh no, every child has to have this kind of family and this kind of religious beliefs and this kind of education and so forth. Well, we're moving past that. So the Act now has some definitions that build on First Nations concepts. You can redefine this according to your practices, but a family, what is a family, includes a person who the child considers to be a close relative, or who the Indigenous people, the First Nation, consider in accordance, you see the bolded language there, with the customs, traditions, or customary adoption practices of that First Nation people to be a close relative. So your customs and practices are important. And I'll say, just for community I'm working closely with, my own community, Musqueam Lake Cree Nation, I know they're participating or listening today. A lot of the early work that's been done has been working with family heads, engaging families, making sure that there's perhaps a kinship committee in place so that the customs and traditions of children being connected to their families is managed by family heads and informed by family heads. That's our custom, as opposed to the child welfare director deciding, oh, this foster parent is like open and available today, and that will be where you go. So it's a very new, totally repudiates that. And the same with the concept of who is a care provider. This has been broadly interpreted to be able to recognize First Nations customs and traditions on who is a care provider. Like for instance, grandparents, right? Grandparents are like very respected care providers in many First Nations families. It's actually just a sign of respect that a grandparent will raise grandchildren. They'll often pick a grandchild and raise or take grandchildren as a caregiver, and it can be according to First Nations customs. So what can we learn about how this new laws are working 1 year later? A couple of things I would talk about. One is it's important to know that you have a spectrum of choices as a community and as community leadership. You don't have to say we're taking the whole system or we're doing nothing. You can make choices. You have a lot of tracks to work on. You have a lot of activity to engage in. You don't need any further mandates from a federal or a provincial government. Everything you need to go forward is in the legislation. It's a question of drawing it down and going forward. And you can work with your existing agencies. We do have many delegated Aboriginal agencies that have been operating under the provincial systems. A lot of them do exist and are supported by BCRs. You can work with them, you cannot work with them. So the governments have choices. You can reset the service arrangements with them that they have to apply First Nations law and practices and not apply provincial laws and practices. So there's a lot of options that we are seeing here. So there's multiple paths to exercise that authority and jurisdiction. And some of the areas of focus may be new legislation that you will be developing at the tribal level, Indigenous legal order work, we call it, developing Indigenous laws and practices reflecting the values and priorities of First Nations. I'm going to talk a bit about funding. We're going to be talking about that more in future webinars as well. It's important to know that not all regions are in the same place. There's lots of flexibility for regional factors, provincial approaches, and other approaches. And the other thing I was going to say is that this legislation, while it's been in place for a year, it can still be enhanced and added to by other changes that might come, like federal UNDRIP legislation that may also confirm and bring additional support to the work. Now, the next sort of diagram I have for you is just looking at how does First Nations law work in this area. So in the middle of that circle is the capacity of First Nations governments to pass laws. Now, you'll see that it says Section 88 of the Indian Act is pushed out. In the past, all the child welfare legislation came through the Indian Act and applied to First Nations through Section 88 of the Indian Act. And this was really challenging because that meant that it was impossible to get that pushed back. All the provincial, once Section 88 of the Indian Act allowed the child welfare systems in, it was almost out of our hands what could be done. This legislation slams that door shut. That is no longer the case. And this is one of the biggest, most contentious points because provinces haven't quite figured that out because for so many years they had the right just to show up and remove children. This has been, I'm going to call it a bit of a slapdown to say, sorry, you can't do things that way. You have to have new relationships. So we're working through that. So in the middle of that is that authority, that circle is the authority of First Nations to make your own choices about what you want to do. You don't have to worry about the province having authority and being able to dictate to you. You now can take that space back. You can work in it. You can set your own priorities. What does it mean? So I put on the left-hand side, there's some examples of lawmaking authority. Say a First Nation wants to enter the area, but they're not too sure they want everything because they don't know what they're dealing with. They don't know how many kids they've got. They don't know how they're going to build the system. Or even in this past year with the pandemic, there's many priorities on the government. It's too hard to just take everything right away. So I just listed some of the areas of what are child and family services. You can do prevention services. Maybe there's some very significant work on family violence or addictions or whatever area you feel is important. A lot of support in terms of cultural support, cultural practices, and strengthening that kind of whole toolkit you have with your cultural knowledge keepers, leaders, elders, and family heads. Prevention. You can do family support. You can do child protection or guardianship if you want to do that. You could do youth support. There's special needs, custom adoption. You could do reunification programs to do like roots and reunification for people that have been lost into the system. You can do emergency services. You can deal with post-majority supports, transitions to adulthood. These are just some areas that you can pick and put a priority on. Some nations are putting a priority on early years, for instance, like, focusing on under 5. They might do it by age, but there's lots of focus. On the right-hand side, you can see the ability to pass law means the ability to make decisions to enforce that law. Effectively, this new child welfare legislation gives us authority to make those decisions and enforce the decisions. So in some instances, our nations have tribunals. In other instances, we will be developing actual courts that will be dealing with child welfare matters and will be dealing with other matters. This is not surprising. In the US, there have been tribal courts doing this for 40 years. In Canada, we haven't seen that. Although the first year we haven't got a lot of examples, I know some of the nations that have triggered the process, like the Hawaiian on Vancouver Island as an example, they have a very successful tribunal. They are using it for all sorts of things. They will use it for this. So it may not be called a court, but it will be a dispute resolution body. And I think that the decisions that it make will be the decisions that stick. So going on to the next one in terms of how do you go forward? Well, if I can direct your attention, if you're trying to decide what do we do as a community, the first thing is everything is there in Section 18. Section 18 recognizes that inherent right includes child and family services, includes the authority to administer and enforce laws and provide for dispute resolution mechanisms. So don't spend any time negotiating because it's already there. You need to administer, you need to go forward on that front. So what can you do? So these are just some nation-based steps you can consider. I mentioned at the outset, there's about 23 First Nations or First Nations conglomerates, like Treaty 2 has a number of First Nations working together. There's like umbrella efforts as well, nations that are extending on a treaty basis. About 23 have notified the minister that they intend to take control over child and family services, either unilaterally because they're passing their own law, or because they're going to do it and they've requested a coordination table. So that starts with a notification under Section 20. Like I give an example here. So for, I'll use my own Muskie Lake First Nation, they notify Canada and Saskatchewan of the intent to pass a law, right? So that notification for Muskie Lake went in June of 2020. Technically under the legislation, you have 1 year to have a coordinating agreement. If that is in place, fine. If it isn't, First Nations laws are paramount and they start operating. So there's a transition allowed. Because of the pandemic, we're probably going to extend that transition a bit because we need a bit more time to coordinate. You can have a coordination table. Very important to say, why is it called coordination? Because in children and families, we coordinate how we work together because kids show up everywhere. So let's use Saskatchewan as an example. If Muskie Lake is exercising its traditional laws and authority over children and families, and one of the kids shows up in Regina, we want the child and family system in Regina to hold the child and bring them to the system in Muskie Lake. So we have to coordinate. How do we do that? How do we deal with emergencies? How do we make sure we're talking to each other? Children and families show up all over Canada. How do we make sure we do that with other parts of Canada? Children and families show up in the US. And I know we've recently been grappling with a case where we have a family stateside and we're working as a nation. And we've tried to identify the Indian Child Welfare Agency, the tribal child welfare agency in the state in which our family is located. And we will work with that Indian Child Welfare Agency there to do courtesy support for us while we get connected to the child. So these are things governments do, is we're connecting and coordinating. When our laws come into force, you can have your law come into force immediately without coordination, or you can coordinate over a period of a year and have a coordination agreement. Those laws come into effect, they operate, everyone has to follow the First Nations law. That's very significant, how that will work and what that will mean. And so this is part of our thinking about the legislation, is to realize that those are changes. Now, if you have a law developed with a coordinated approach, how does that go down? So you notify Canada. I give you the example of Muskie Lake or the other 23 nations. You can request a coordination agreement. After 12 months, you can put your laws in force and make the transition. You can extend your time. Very important to know you can extend time. Also, you can, if you have a conflict between your First Nations law and the federal or provincial law that's applying, it's going to be mostly provincial child welfare law. What prevails? This is very important. What has paramountcy? What prevails? one of the nuggets of this legislation is that First Nations law and authority will prevail. Now, first year out of the legislation, we do not have any cases. We do not, I can't give you a list of all of the examples. We're not there yet. We're getting there. These things are going to have an issue and they are going to be determined and decided, but you must conduct yourself as First Nations with the understanding that this is a tool that's there for you. Full force and effect to First Nations laws. That means in the provincial system, they'll have to recognize and apply them. This is, it's the first time really. We have had other First Nations laws recognized, but frequently through a delegated model where there'll be delegated, like, tax laws, delegated systems that are in place under other sort of initiatives. This one's the first time it'll be recognized based on inherent rights and inherent authority. So no doubt there's going to be some significant interest there and possibly some significant discussion there. In terms of reasserting or reclaiming jurisdiction, again, I just want to be clear, there's no one door. Like, think about what works for your community. Think about what your priorities are. Work with Canada, ask Canada to support your process. Ask Canada to come to where you are. Like, it's very important to go where First Nations governments are and what you need to get there. Many people, like I'll take Splatson as an example, they've been working on this since 1980. They passed the first bylaw on children and families that was allowed. It never got stopped by Canada. They've been doing this work for years. And they have a long history of preventing their kids from being in care, applying their own values, and they're going to continue to do that. So there's no one door. I just want to say, though, what I'm seeing in the list of 23 that have been notified is there's going to be a lot of updates. So today we're giving a high-level summary. In the near future, we probably will have a forum. Maybe this time next year we'll have a forum where 10 First Nations will be presenting to you about how their laws are working. Behind it is not just about having a law. The purpose is get the kids out of the system, keep kids out of the system, keep them connected, and making it become just ordinary in Canada that First Nations have control over children and families, and that people have to work to that. I know that sounds like a massive shift, but it's where we need to go. So the other point I'll say at the bottom of this slide is, RC Hart talked about this a little bit. Regional Chief Hart talked a little bit about this morning. The amount of advocacy and work that the chiefs and leaders have done, and the late, Elder Corshane, all of those knowledge keepers, all of those, residential school survivors who spoke passionately about the need to change the child welfare system. That was one of the most important things to do. Things have not changed that quickly this year. I think it's fair to say, it's not a criticism, it's just to say the pandemic has been a major factor, right? Pandemic is a significant factor to us. At the same time, it gives us a chance to think, right? To think about things and work together. It also has given us this chance to focus on what really is a priority, which is our relationships and our families and our communities' survival and the protection of our elders and our knowledge, language, and identity. So we've strengthened, despite this pandemic, on these priorities. So this slide talks about what are some of the things that we also have to weigh when we're doing our own First Nations systems. Well, they're based on inherent rights. It has to align with the UN Declaration, but we also have to think about fundamental human rights. So there's this issue of how are the rights of individuals to be protected? And as you know, even in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there's like 16 of the provisions have to do with the individual rights of, like, not to experience discrimination. An individual has rights as well as the collective rights. So when we're thinking about the systems and how they're going to work, we have to balance that. There are a lot of concerns about how the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms could impact our laws. That was a concern from the outset. There are provisions in the legislation that say the charter can only apply to the First Nations Child and Family Service System in a way that doesn't take away from those inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights. But that does put pressure on First Nations, and we've seen this in elections and other areas. You have to have an internal process. Like I talked about the Hawaiian Tribunal, you have to have somewhere for people to take their conflicts, for them to be adjudicated and decided fairly. And we have to think about that as well. So as we're building our laws, what about the cases that will come up where maybe someone's not treated well internally? How do we deal with it? It's not just the placement of the child. Maybe there's like dueling band members, right? So one saying, oh, I've been discriminated against. So we have to have internal process. We have to strengthen that to make sure it's there. And that is something that we are working on and need to continue to work on, because it will be a major issue in a lot of different areas. So in terms of how do we then do implementation work for and with a nation? So again, I can speak about like smaller First Nations are focusing a bit more on an umbrella type law. Okay, so they're looking at things like, okay, we have a First Nations education system for K to 12. We have First Nations health supports. We have childcare. Should we have a single umbrella approach so that we have our child and family, our health, our education all together? Because it makes sense, because maybe we're a small community of 1,500 to 2,000 people. Like, it doesn't make sense to have 5 different massive programs on all these systems. How can we make it a simple kind of umbrella? This is coming forward. And I would just say that like, make it practically suit your community. Think about how you can bring people. If children are at the center, they should be at the center of all of the programs. So think about some of that program design, planning, and reflection around how to best serve children. And we do have siloed programs and services because that's how they're handed down to us from Indigenous services or other federal or provincial ministries and departments. We should think about it more in terms of how do we comprehensively, holistically support children at the center? How do we make our education system, our child and family system, and our health system work for the children and the families, right? So we have silos, they tend to follow where the money is. This is a chance to think a little bigger. And so I know some communities are doing that. For some, it's a daunting task, but I'm just saying, I think it's an opportunity. You should really consider how you might bring some of those services and concepts under a more holistic approach that's offered with this legislation. And that's, again, not telling people what to do, just sharing what other people are doing. I mentioned earlier, how do you trigger the process? And R.C. Hart, Regional Chief Hart, said this as well. An Indigenous governing body, IGB, that can be a band council. You trigger the process. If it's a band council, you need a BCR within the chief and council structure, but it could be hereditary and elected system. It's very open. You can serve notice, you set up a coordinating table, you get funding for that table, you start discussions. You then can work on your laws and how you'll draw down your services. As I say, you have a year, you have more time. The final bullet point on that slide, fiscal issues. Okay, we're not going to have a chance to get into it at length. Fiscal issues in terms of capacity development, law development, system change, that's important. We need resources and we need to use them to do this change. Then once we run the system, we need operational funding. So as you know, there's been major human rights cases around funding for First Nations children and families. That's been around the delegated provincial agencies, Indigenous agencies operating, and the differential level of funding. So there's a significant discussion around what is statutory funding, what is funded in this legislation. The legislation includes a commitment to funding, but the commitment is needs-based, structural, long-term funding. So you do need to have discussions about your needs as a First Nations government. You might also have to have some discussions regionally or provincially about your needs in the region. So what happens? I just wanted to do this slide about what happens to First Nations children and youth if you have your system built and it's running. Let's just like talk about what would it look like. Well, let's run through them. Okay, new principles apply. Okay, automatically in any proceeding in that sort of white provincial system, chief has standing, family members have standing, and caregivers have standing. Even though you never had it under the provincial system, you now have a right to go speak to the issue of the children, talk about and defend your system, and have the child's needs met. It's really important. You have this right to notice about decisions about kids. You have a right to promote placement priorities that they stay with families. You have a right to speak up and ensure that the birth alerts are ended. And of course, the bigger one is to insist you know if the number of children in care are being reduced in your region from your own membership, Like, you know, if you're a small community and you say, I've got 50 kids in care, we want to review every one of their files. We want to reduce that number. We don't want new kids coming into care. We want to get them out of care. So really keeping that goal in mind. You know, I make the point, and we're going to talk about it more, is that it's more than one law that changes the system. These are ripples that are coming out. People change systems. People that stand up and fight for their children and families is what changes systems. Systems don't change people. And the tools that we have here are significant and meaningful. What did I also want to just bring your attention to? Thinking more farther ahead. We're 1 year into the implementation of this legislation. We're in a pandemic. We're facing some barriers, but we're still getting this work done. What do we need to know? The legislation requires that it's reviewed every 5 years to see if it's working. So by 2025, Parliament will have to review it with the input from First Nations. So if there's things you're seeing that are not working, it's important that you elevate them up through your chief and leadership regionally and to the AFN level, and that we improve this legislation, this process. So it's an opportunity to continually improve over time. It isn't like, here it is, take it or leave it. This is a process. We're going to have to keep strengthening it. Without a doubt, we have a list already for those who advise Assembly of First Nations and Chiefs. We have a list of things that we'd like to see strengthened, improved, or clarified. So as you're coming through it, think about that. This is going to change and improve. Always be flexible, keep things open for the future so that you can keep benefiting from that. And we've seen that with some of the modern treaty First Nations. They may have had a treaty agreement that allows for them to exercise child and welfare authority only if like a territorial or provincial government approved. Now there's First Nations authority without that requirement, right? So like things change, things improve. Sometimes things created in an era of denial of rights, a more oppressive era, we can't like grandfather those in. We got to benefit from new thinking. So there will be periodic review. The fiscal issues are going to be the focus of a lot of discussion at your table, at the regional, provincial table, and at the national table. The commitment is that Canada give predictable, stable, sustainable needs-based funding to secure long-term positive outcomes for children, youth, and families. That's the principle in the legislation. Okay, there isn't a funding section in the legislation, it's a funding principle. So we're going to be doing a lot more discussing and work on that. The legislation also provides for the opportunity to have regulations. And there might be regulations on a regional basis. It's supposed to be distinctions based, so it should really be the First Nations track to implement this. We really are not that captivated by what Métis and Inuit are doing. This is a First Nations track, so we are working strongly with Canada on that. In terms of what's happening, what's missing, what work is occurring, I would just say that there's a lot of political accords being developed around how to implement this regionally. We have a national one with Canada and AFN chiefs, just on the higher level issues, not to supplant the discussions or the authority, but just to kick up and bring forward national level issues that come through resolutions and that are being identified. So there may be regional protocols, maybe in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, what have you, you may have regional decisions on how to do things. I just put in here some missing elements. These are things that were talked about by First Nations leaders and First Nations people who participated in developing the legislation, who were engaged. They said they needed certain things. It didn't show up in C92. So I just would return to some of that good thinking to say, you know, we see that they're missing and we feel the missing. And we probably have to deal with it. So first of all, on the left-hand side, we don't have an independent national First Nations child advocate. We do thankfully have Cindy Blackstock, who's a complete, as we all know, rock star and has worked tirelessly, but we don't have a proper role where they have access to information and really, like the National Indian Child Welfare Agency in the US, we don't have an entity that's there at the national level, just monitoring implementation of this, reporting on it, advocating, supporting and informing the work, giving more support to First Nations, like outside government. So it's not just us working with government and then not getting the technical and other expertise. That was something that people wanted, an independent child advocate role. It's not there. We're still tangled in a lot of conflicts around implementing the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders and so forth. So there's a whole bundle of work there that I would say it's missing. It hasn't fully congealed. It hasn't come forward. There's going to need to be more pressure and more thinking about how to do it to meet your needs. The other side is more First Nations directed training and technical assistance. This is a basic webinar. We're trying to provide information and support each other and work together and learn from each other. But we need more training and assistance, more technical expertise provided by First Nations people for First Nations people. And we need to learn from what's happening, share those practices, develop standards and policies, and of course, develop data and accountability so we can report on things like, it was a bit of a disappointment to me at the first year of the bill coming into force. We didn't get a report from Canada that said, year one, this is how many children in care there are today, how it's gone down or up. Now, some jurisdictions I work in, BC, we were able to look at that. There was a substantial drop in the number of children in care. That was because BC First Nations leaders really have the government of British Columbia in a positive relationship, but also a high degree of accountability to report in detail what the shifts are. And we need to do better on those shifts, but we didn't have that at the national level, right? So without that kind of like real lens, we have our impressions of how things are working, but do we know? So we need to do a little bit more on that as well. My final sort of comment, then I'll leave it there for today, is in terms of sort of next steps for like you listening. I just really wanted to say how it's important to organize and make internal decisions about your own laws and policies, make them free from interference from anyone, thinking about where you want to go, how you want to build your own teams and decision making, and to reach out for support if you need support. And for us, of course, through our organizations of chiefs, our kinship networks that we provide support, it's important to keep advocating for each child and family, every single one. Speak up. Even if you have to have a template, you have active advocates, just keep speaking up, keep doing that work during the transition. We also, of course, need more support from the federal government to make the national changes that are needed. And I would just say that because I do monitor like court decisions in the first year, and I look at how it's been decided. There's still big decisions being made about the placement of First Nations kids, and they're not taking into account the federal law adequately. So that's not what we would like to see. We'd like to see that change. I know the pandemic is a factor, but at some point we're going to have to get Canada to step up, support us. Maybe that's the Attorney General Lametti, making sure we have funding to bring these principles to life and to make sure that anytime a First Nations child's life is being considered in somewhere, that these principles are there and that they are the law and they're the guidance. So I'm going to end it there. And I know I've covered a lot of territory, Matthew. I will stop and see if there might be some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tapelafon. We do have a couple of questions that came into me. Specifically there was one around the birth alerts. How is it that they're still taking place? Is there recourse? And could there be consequences for those hospitals that are, or I guess I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism for an alert is. So is there consequences for those who are setting up the alert and then those who are abiding by the alert?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, that goes just to the very heart of what we've been dealing with in terms of the racism and the discrimination that allowed these very colonial child welfare laws to come into place and break up families. The birth alerts, in my respectful view as a law professor and someone who's worked in this field for a long time and as a lawyer, they have never been legal in terms of taking your private information and pasting it into an entire healthcare system. And that has so harmed people for a long time, including making our First Nations moms really reluctant to ask for help because they get a birth alert. So the fact that there still are birth alerts is unconscionable. I mean, if we have a year later, we still have a birth alert somewhere, and I know there are some provinces and territories that say they're going to phase it out, but they haven't. That is just not acceptable. So in my view, it's not legal, it's not appropriate. The harm that has been caused by it ongoing, like the continuing effects of that harm have really impacted us in terms of access to healthcare. And so I do see for women, Indigenous women, even by the time they're grandparents, their kids have grown up, they still feel they cannot access needed healthcare and they are treated disrespectfully in the healthcare system. So that is the discrimination, the stain of discrimination. So the work we're doing in the child welfare system to end this is essential. We need governments to stand with us and stop this. And number two, the work we're doing in the healthcare system has to be to remove that. We have to get that racism, that private information that was blasted saying someone's a bad parent or whatever out of that healthcare system. Healthcare system should be about supporting people who need healthcare, not shaming them and blaming them about some child protection workers' view of their parenting. So very important question. A lot of advocacy is going to be needed, and will there be legal actions and remedies? I don't doubt that there will have to be, because harm has been done.
That's where I was going with that next, the follow-up into, are there legal remedies, like put these hospitals on notice by sending them, I don't know, I don't even know what the legal recourse might be, but letting them know that these are illegal activities and they should cease and desist kind of ideas. But I guess that's what you're saying, that can possibly happen. I guess from First Nations, what can they do when the notice is not happening from the province? I guess a notice requirement in the legislation resulting in Indigenous children not being served by Indigenous agencies. So I guess the notification is not happening.
Yeah, so the important thing for First Nation to do is to send another clear letter to the Director of Child Welfare to say, all children from our nation, all decisions, you must notify us. And here's the person you notify. And I would like to see the federal government do a registry, like a one-stop place where you can always link to find who the contact is. So if it's your nation, you know who to, so they can't say, well, we don't know who to reach out to. So we need to simplify these processes. You have to get notified. And this again goes back to the issue of registration. A lot of First Nations children, particularly under 10, are not registered properly to their nation. We also have all the problems of unstated paternity, discrimination in Indian status. So part of the work with kinship is going to have to be like kinship, right? Like who belongs to your community? How do you make those decisions? So again, the barriers that have been there on registration do plague us, but I think you send out clarity, make sure they know how to reach out to you, and make sure you're getting the notice, and make sure you have enough capacity, new staff member, maybe get yourself a new full-time staff member whose job is to just monitor notice and link people up, right? So build out your capacity to be able to take the notice and engage with families when you get the notice.
Yeah, there's another question that I was posing. It's I guess the context of the history of all this, right? The idea that children were taken, they don't know where they come from, they don't know what their nation is, and then they're having children of their own, and perhaps they are struggling as a family themselves, right? So they're in the urban environment, they're not exactly sure whose nation they belong to because of the history of the systems, and then they're having a child and they're struggling themselves. So I guess it's the challenge of who would be responsible for that child as a government, right? And I extend that also to mixed families from two nations, and they split apart, and then there's conflict about the child. I mean, I'm just thinking about the work that has to happen to have a broad system that takes care of all the children, no matter where they reside and whom they are responsible, or who's responsible for them. So I don't know if any thought has been done around those kinds of challenges that are going to be coming in the future.
Yeah, there's two distinct things that you've mentioned there, Matthew, that come from the questions. The first is, from a First Nations viewpoint, what I find is many of the nations using values, customs, and traditions and Indigenous law, the child is sacred. And so the child has a right to be connected to all their families, right? So to include everyone. But of course, they may be more closely connected to one because that's just the way they've been raised. But the idea is like keeping all of those relationships there. That's important because child welfare has just chopped up everything, right? So we're trying to restore. And then the second part of the question that you raised, which is all of the, let's call it a diaspora, where Indigenous kids went to residential school, they didn't come back. Families went through 60 Scoop. Like all of these colonial practices that have served to smash up families. What do we do about that, right? Well, first of all, it's not really our harm. It was caused by the system, but we have to rebuild. And I think what the big piece is really ensuring there's funding and resources for cultural supports and kinship supports, making sure our elders, knowledge keepers, kinship committees and leaders have the ability to do the roots work with the families that are coming in, and also explaining to them what it means to be connected to your family and nation. So the cultural work, the language work. So that roots work is really important, right? And one of the things we do see is how wonderful that is when good roots work is done, right? When that happens, those reconnections are really brilliant and beautiful and positive. But again, we need roots workers, right? We need to have some staff to do that. We need our elders supported. We need the, language. Like, this is a whole revitalization process with child and families. And we're learning a lot about how people were harmed and how people were shamed. So normally where the mom shamed and kids were removed, people were told totally like lies about their families and communities. And so rebuilding relationships is going to take time. But welcoming, using ceremony, using protocol, supporting elders and knowledge keepers, these are really important parts of the First Nations government's programs. They need to have a roots program. They need to have elders and cultural supports there to do this work. And I see a lot of it already happening, but it has to be supported, right? So it's really important to make this meaningful, and that we stop that busting up of families, but we are going to have to repair. And so the repair work takes special people, and I know we have a lot of great people that can do that.
One other question, just final item. I'm aware of the time here. We have our next guest coming up next, but you did speak a little bit about the child advocates that exist in the United States. I guess maybe your initial thoughts on what the role of an advocate might be nationally.
Yeah, I think almost every First Nations community needs to have someone. Like, I know, like Duke Pelche, for instance, is the children's commissioner, right? The Anishinaabe children's commissioner. I lift him up because he's a godfather to my son too, even though we're Cree. But I think, people have identified children's commissioners and children's advocates at the nation level and the band level. Do that in every one of your nations. Like, say, you've got to be the advocate. We need one person internally. But then when we lift our sights up to Canada, we need a national Indigenous Children's Commissioner. And again, I give a big shout out to Cindy Blackstock, who single-handedly, without any legislation, has driven this and pulled people together and lifted things up and shown how effective it can be. But what are the roles and responsibilities? One is to support and inform about the bill and about this change. The other is to monitor and keep track of whether government is doing everything it can do to implement this. And 3 is to make sure we get the technical and other support. This is a massive shift. This is a big, important work. It's going to take more than just leaving First Nations governments out there in the field trying to figure it out. We need higher level supports. And I think the National Indian Child Welfare Agency in the US, it has about 30 years of experience supporting tribal governments, supporting roots, supporting, tribal courts. I think it's a good role model of what we could have here if we had a strong Indigenous agency and a strong First Nations agency. So these are some of the things they can do. Keep identifying the needs. Communities should keep identifying the needs and sending it up through the system. So your regional chiefs, your national chiefs, and others can keep bringing that issue forward and try and see if we can achieve further change to support us.
I did promise was the last question, but something just popped in my mind, and that was that legislative review talked about, built into the legislation every 5 years. Have we also built in, evaluation tools, data tools that will allow us, coming year 4 or whatever it might be, that we're actually gathering information that would inform the review? So I don't know if there's some thought around that.
Yeah, there are some provisions in the legislation where the minister can, for instance, get access to information. The minister has to prepare a report, and they have to do it in collaboration and cooperation with First Nations. So we will need to get organized to talk about how that will happen. That should be a thorough report, and it should really look at whether First Nations Children and Families have been supported, First Nations government. So whether the promise of this legislation has been realized, and if it hasn't, what has to change for the next 5 years? So that periodic review, you know, it's sometimes with children and families, we got urgent issues today, right, Matthew? So that's always a big problem. Like, we're so focused in the here and now, that we have to keep system change in mind and remember that let's keep bringing it forward. Even if a community is seeing a barrier, bring it up through your regional First Nations organizations and to your national organization to make sure that it can be looked at. What data should be in that report? What should we hear the voices of? How should we know, like, what are the performance measures? Is this working or not? I just gave one, which is number of children in care. We want no Indigenous children in care. We want no Indigenous children in stranger foster care. That should be achievable in 5 years, you know? So we're gonna wanna see that as an example, but there's a lot more. So you're right, we gotta keep the longer view. And like many people who have worked in this, like back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, we understand that, like, we're trying to achieve major change. It is not on our shoulders completely. Systems need to change, and they are very slow to change. This is a big industry, First Nations children and families, often controlled by non-First Nations. You know, in some provinces like Quebec, foster parents are unionized. So we are shifting, but we need to make sure that these shifts are meaningful and that they continue at a good pace.
Miigwech, Dr. Turpel Lafond, that was an awesome presentation, and thank you for taking the time for answering those questions. We didn't get to them all, but of course our participants will follow up with everyone who did send a question. And again, I'll remind all our participants that a donation will be made in your name to supporting youth in transition. So Miigwech, again, thank you very much. With that, we have a new guest coming at around 3 minutes. So we have 3 minutes to have a little break until our next guest, which is Minister Miller, will be joining us. So do take your time, grab a cup of coffee, send us your questions ahead of time if you already know what they are, and we'll be preparing for a minister conversation next. So back in 3 minutes, everyone. Thank you very much to our panelists and to the Dr. Turpel Lafond. We'll be back. Bonjour, Ani. Matthew Krishnandis. Welcome back. That was a huge break. Hope you had time to go for a long 20-minute walk, 3 minutes break time. We are back with Indigenous Services Canada update. We're honored to have the Honorable Mark Miller, who's the Minister of Indigenous Services, joining us. As we did with Dr. Tapelafon, we will have a presentation by the Minister, and we'll open the floor up for questions. And then following the Minister's comments, and then we'll go to Q&As, a couple of announcements, and I think we'll wrap up our day with that. So with that, we'll transition right into our presentation and welcome Minister Miller, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Kwekwe, hello, bonjour. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the most pressing matter, namely the well-being of First Nations children and all Indigenous children in Canada. First, as I am in Ottawa, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, and I'm pleased to connect with you from the various territories and nations you are in, albeit remotely today. All children in Canada should have the opportunity to grow up in their communities, immersed in their cultures and surrounded by their loved ones, and something we all deeply believe in. A little over a year ago, the Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families came into force. It was a historic day for many communities and groups who will soon exercise jurisdiction over their child and family services. I must note that we wouldn't be where we are here today on child and family services reform and on the implementation of the Act if it wasn't for the fearless and ambitious advocacy of many of those on the line today. It was advocacy that arose from generations of knowledge and was centered in your communities. Now, a large number of Indigenous groups have already told us that they want to exercise jurisdiction over their own child and family services, and many others are engaging in discussions with communities and governments in this regard. This is good news and an important step forward. I was pleased earlier this month to participate in Wasimung's Independent Nation ceremony to celebrate an important achievement. They became the first Indigenous community to have its own child care law come into force. We know others with full coordination agreements aren't far behind. In July of 2020, National Chief Perry Bellegarde and myself participated in a signing ceremony for a protocol that was co-developed to establish a new structure to support discussions on the implementation of the Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. This protocol is helping all parties guide and facilitate discussions around the implementation of the Act and to ensure that those discussions continue in a spirit of co-development. The Act celebrated its first anniversary in coming into force January 1st of last year, and significant steps have now been made towards its objectives. For example, as of December 23rd of 2020, 26 confirmed Indigenous governing bodies have submitted a notice of request to exercise jurisdiction under the Act, representing 64 Indigenous groups and communities. Moving forward, we've heard very clearly the need for predictable and sustainable funding during the development of this legislation. We know critical funding investments are needed to reform the FNCFS program. By collaborating and working with partners like AFN, we'll be able to support those communities at various stages. We've heard you, and it took time, a long time, to create these and develop all these issues surrounding the Act, but we want to work with you to resolve these in partnership. This past summer, over $542 million over 5 years was announced to support communities at various stages of implementation and readiness. And this is just the start. In addition, in order to provide an initial and rapid support, funding has been allocated in advance to capacity building activities for Section 35 rights holding groups who had identified an immediate need to begin their work to develop their own legislation and delivery models. A first wave of capacity building funding totaling nearly $12 million has been announced to support 26 Indigenous groups in order to support them in exploring Indigenous-led child and family services. It's important to remember that the Act accomplishes two historical and important things. First, it establishes a set of principles based on the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It recognizes that the decisions about the future and the well-being of children should be based on the best interests of those children and on the rights of those children and their families. Second, it recognizes that the inherent right to self-government includes jurisdiction in relation to child and family services. The Act is clear about this. The spirit of the Act underscores the importance of a distinct Indigenous approach to managing those services. Who better to provide child and family services than the people who share the history and language of beneficiaries? As we move forward in implementing the Act, we will continue to collaborate with partners, provincial and territorial governments. This includes discussions across the country on best practices, lessons learned, and on issues related to implementation. We need to ensure a coordinated approach in the best interests of First Nations children. We will also work closely with partners to implement regulations on the Act to move forward on our jointly signed protocol to establish distinctions-based engagement mechanisms and to work with communities where they are to see more exercise of their inherent jurisdiction. Our government is firmly committed to addressing the long-standing unmet need of First Nations children. We'll continue to implement the order to expand eligibility under Jordan's principle. We look forward to the ruling so that we may continue to advance reform. From the outset, we've recognized that there are challenges with respect to the jurisdiction of the CHRT. I know this will perhaps be a question, particularly on issues of identity and belonging within a community. We're not leaving First Nations children behind, and First Nations children will not go without services that non-Indigenous children get. I wanted to be clear about that. Our government will continue to work with partners to ensure First Nations children have access to the products, services, and support they need when they need them. On December 3rd, 2020 of this past year, the Government of Canada introduced Bill C-15, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. This bill is yet another important step in making sure that every Indigenous child is protected with specific application into Canadian law. Through this legislation, we will help to create the conditions for everyone to benefit from the same opportunities. Our approach has been and continues to be one based on respect, inclusion, and fairness. The path to reconciliation is not a simple one, nor is it achieved overnight. As I conclude, I want to thank the Assembly of First Nations for inviting us in this gathering. We will support the tripartite tables to move forward at the nation and provincial levels so that strong leadership and innovation are supported. I believe the steps we've taken together will benefit all concerned, but First Nations children most of all. I'm resolute in my commitment to implementing this act, and I look forward to pursuing this great collaboration. Miigwech, thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Minister Miller. You've been so efficient. We weren't ready for questions yet. I appreciate. Thank you very much. I guess maybe I'll start off because I think I've been provided with a couple of questions here. How can First Nations access funding to develop their own laws under the Act and deliver child family services? So I guess it's a process question, accessing that.
Thanks, Matthew. And I wasn't trying the tested and true tactic of running out the clock. Even I felt what I had to say was important, so our teams did try to keep it short. But I think you've posed an important question. The amounts that were announced, in fact, in not this last fiscal update, but the one prior during December under the former Finance Minister Bill Morneau, of $542 million for capacity building, for walking hand in hand with communities as they develop and lift up their own inherent jurisdiction. What was intended to do so over a period of 5 years, knowing that different communities, there would be, for example, early adopters, and we've seen the ones that I mentioned in my speech, as well as other communities that perhaps would need even more engagement. So it's a longer process, and the way to do it is to engage with Indigenous Services Canada, engage with our team to see what needs are there as communities go down the path of lifting up their jurisdiction. Everyone is squarely focused on the child and the families that are in some cases are welcoming and their communities are welcoming their children home. What I've heard in early engagement ranges along a spectrum of more information with respect to what the Act does, how it allows communities to welcome back their children, to lift up their jurisdiction, to capacity building activities, including services that needed to be offered, and all the structuring around shifting what was the basis of the Act in the first place, which is to move from a broken model of intervention to prevention. So it isn't specifically up to Indigenous Services Canada to dictate the terms, but really one of communities and Indigenous representative organizations to engage with us for the funds and needs that they may have. And we really haven't waited. And as I mentioned at the conclusion of my words, we've moved forward with a number of communities in helping them on their initial steps towards submitting perhaps their notices and then working with them with their legislation.
So another question we have is around the implementation. I guess the first part, the commitment was around the development of the laws, the development of the framework under which they would then assume jurisdictions start delivering the program. Is there a plan within the government during COVID to actually start supporting the implementation of these new laws or new acts, and assuming the assumption of the jurisdiction?
Well, yes. I mean, look, as we saw with Wapsimung, they did not have a coordination agreement. The path they chose to take, for example, was theirs. The idea of a coordination agreement under the Act is not one that is necessarily met with unanimity. This is something that, as a government, we need to respect the spirit and intent of proposing coordination agreements in a year period whereby we engage with Indigenous communities is to ensure that children aren't falling through the cracks, and that we have the provincial partners at the table. And so there may be different paths chosen by different communities. In BC, there is a BC-led process and a BC process that we will respect, knowing that we also have to respect the needs and desires expressed by different rights holders. But when we talk about implementation, we talk about a number of things: getting the legislation or legislative bodies into place, building up all the structure around it, working with communities to select perhaps which aspects they will focus on. And those are continuous discussions that we're very much at the beginning period. So as there is no other community that has entered, or there's no community that's entered into a coordination agreement, and we're eagerly awaiting that to happen, and very hopeful, and we obviously want to show progress. We will be working with communities as they implement these, because it will not necessarily, it'll be a staggered process and a phased-in process. And so, to be quite clear on your answer, we'll need a piece of legislation that is subject to a coordination agreement, or part of a coordination agreement, to work on the actual implementation. This is also part of the work that we will be doing once we pass C-15, in order to ensure that our laws do conform with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Another question, I think, is a reflection of as First Nations start assuming responsibility and start, creating the infrastructure and the governance structures to allow them to assume these kinds of responsibility. One question being asked is around the infrastructure required. Will there be an ask under Bill C-91 to build the infrastructure, the bricks and mortar kind of things that are required to, to be to actually assume these kinds of responsibilities, to have the offices, the space for children, those kinds of things that are required to be a child and family service.
Yeah, and Matthew, this is again an excellent question, and in terms of the funding models that we have within the 542 million that was announced, issues such as housing, such as bricks and mortar infrastructure, do fall outside that amount. And I think when we get into the deep dive of analyses into what is needed in any particular community as to capacity, you'll acknowledge that they will vary. There are some communities that we can't shy away from the fact that there's much more capacity building that needs to be done, including infrastructure, including social support, a number of elements that fall outside the strict category of what we call implementation, but do fall in a more general rubric of capacity building. And that's stuff that we will work with communities. You know, often it could be the situation that those communities may be the communities that have a not insignificant number of children that are in care. And so in those communities, and it's very hard to generalize because each community has its particularities, but you'll hear, and rightly so, this is a comment across the country, that there will be a need to continue on work in and around prevention to get away from the old intervention model. And that goes part and parcel with the discussion over housing, that we will work with communities over specific infrastructure needs. But as far as the amounts that fall within the amount that was announced, 542 million within Indigenous Services Canada, those requests are things that would fall outside that envelope of financing.
I guess there's a recognition that, you know, there's lots of legislation going on, and there's lots of, you know, responsibility that First Nations are assuming. And I just think of some communities and just their band office can't even house, you know, the administrators that they have now. So I was thinking now they're assuming more administrative responsibility and having to watch. You know, that's a huge responsibility, right? Knowing where all your kids are, knowing what's happening, and being aware of the status of families, for instance. I guess that's where I'm kind of thinking, where will we put our local advocate if we have no office space anywhere in the community? So I guess there's the question will be, will there be an enhancement around that supporting infrastructure that will allow for First Nations to assume these kinds of responsibilities?
Yeah, and it's part of the work that needs to be done. I mean, not every community will have the same needs, clearly. Not everyone will have the same relationship with agencies that it has, that are as positive in some cases, not in others. And that is, I think, the spirit of these coordination agreements, to ensure that these issues are addressed. We can't shy away from the work that we need to do with provinces, and some more willing to undertake that conversation than others. And it's no surprise that there is a court case in one of the provinces with respect to the jurisdiction of C-92. And so the importance of the coordination agreement is not only to look at the funding models and the supports the community looks at, but also all the resources that surround the process with respect to child and family services that we need to take a deeper dive into, and they will be very particular in how they're expressed in coordination agreements or in the larger conversations that we have with communities. But you're right to raise that question and concern.
Another question that's being raised is around, you know, it's Indigenous services. It's, you know, I guess it's around the distinction based, right? The First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I guess there are questions around is distinction-based implementation, and distinction-based review, and all the things that would be around distinction specific. I don't know if the government has any thoughts on how it's going to implement around these distinction-based formats, or what is the thinking happening now within the government?
You know, I can speculate, but we've certainly seen different approaches as to what perhaps particularly Inuit community would prefer, what road and path they would take. There is, and I think that's one of the overarching questions we have with respect to the phased implementation is it will not be cookie cutter. We have to respect the fact that there are sort of generalized differences between Inuit, Métis, and First Nations within those categories as well. It was one of the issues in around rights holders and representative organizations under the Act, which still has some ambiguity, and we still need some work in defining and refining without being too precise and therefore excluding what might be a rights holder as part of C-92. I'm pretty sure it won't be the case that we'll take a rough population-based distinction and certainly say we will put these into silos for each community if and when they may walk down that path with us with respect to C92. So it's very much of a fluid calculation as to who the early adopters are when they express interest, and we'll work with communities on that distinctions basis. But if were you to ask me if there is a strict number ascribed to, for example, First Nations, the answer is no, because we can't predict who will come forward with their legislative pieces and what extent and support will be needed. So at the risk of being vague, I wanted to be clear in saying that there's no defined categories. So whoever comes for the communities, the 24 communities that have come forward, our teams are working with them, and we're looking for some positive movement.
Section 15 of the Act outlines that a child must not be apprehended on the basis of their socioeconomic conditions, such as inadequate housing or poverty. Does the government have a strategy around, addressing those basic issues or those fundamental issues that sometimes put children in risk? So I guess that support children remaining in their homes and in their communities. Is there other initiatives happening within the government?
Well, what's in the Act is a recognition that far too often that has been the basis upon which apprehension has occurred, and it's unacceptable. So the work we need to do with and respecting the court systems, obviously, but also sensitizing the various bars of each jurisdiction to the fact that these are now standards that need to be applied, are ones, and when you look at the minimum standards of the child that are established nationally, this is something that has been enforced for over a year and a half. So we're looking for positive successes within the court system. Obviously, we want to be moving away from when you're talking about intervention and cases in front of the court. You've missed the large portion of it, which is we don't want to get there in the first place. And so the greater discussion, I believe, and the one of importance is to continue that work that the National Chief often talks about, which is about closing the socioeconomic gaps. The big discussion point, as we've seen through COVID for health reasons, is housing. Definitely supports for education, continued supports for healthcare. Those are all elements in ensuring that the children are raised thriving within their community and their language, and not pushing more towards those models of prevention vis-a-vis intervention. It's also tied into that as the protocol that I mentioned with AFN in the words I offered, which is working with AFN to see and to be sort of a clearinghouse for information and discussions in and around financing and numbers, and sort of not proceed with the bad habits of the past, which is to sort of mischaracterize it, but grossly characterize it as throwing numbers at each other. I'm one person who likes to go down into details with respect to the numbers and what they're for and what they're working towards. And I think it works. These types of protocols, while not limited only to AFN, are a good starting point to refine numbers and to speak about actual issues and how they contribute to communities, without short-circuiting the important work that needs to be done with rights holders.
Right. Just before your presentation, we were joined by Dr. Lafond, and she talked a little bit about what the experts were saying prior to passing the C92, and perhaps the areas that were not addressed within C92. And I think one area she talked about was the child advocate. And also the other area was around the review. And I'm wondering, is the department thinking about how to prepare, or is there a strategy around what lessons might be learned over the 5 years that then can improve Bill C92, or maybe amendments to the bill coming at the 5-year review? So I'm wondering, is there any work being done around the success or the I guess the challenges and perhaps what could be addressed, say, during a review period? That's
no, I mean it's two questions, big ones too, and I think what Dr. Pelifon raised is an important one, which is that C92 didn't come without criticism. It was a result of a tremendous amount of work and diligence and co-drafting. But recognized within that is the work to review it after a certain time, to continue that work. It was hard to presume the outcome of what will go on in the next few years, and certainly no one could have guessed that we would now be in a full year of COVID. And I think that it's important to recognize that there has been, as communities rightly have locked down and to preserve the health and well-being and lives in some cases of their peoples, this has reoriented some priorities. But Child and Family Services was the result of that prioritization at the top of the list of an overwhelming number of Indigenous communities across Canada, as we've seen the failure of the Child Family Services system in Canada. And so it will remain a priority, and I think we're all committed to review it if need be, if we see sort of bumps in the road. But those elements are ones I more than glad to work with, and particularly advocates like Mary Ellen Pelifon.
Thank you, Minister. You know, I'm completely out of questions. We're just too efficient. Usually I have 50 questions in 2 minutes, but now I have 2 minutes and no questions. But I mean, I want to thank you for your willingness to come and speak to us all. Your openness and transparency in terms of being honest, in terms of where you're at and where the government's at. So we do appreciate that. And I don't know if you have any last words and any last things you would like to share with our audience before we come towards adjournment.
Well, no, thanks, Matthew. I just want to encourage everyone to I know we've all seen the skyrocketing numbers in Canada, particularly with respect to active cases of COVID in communities. The amazing work that's been done by health leadership to keep people safe hasn't come without some side effects, including the effects on people's mental health. I just want to encourage everyone for all the amazing work that they've been doing, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There's still a whole heck of a lot of tunnel left. But as we exit or continue to fight through COVID and then exit it with a proper vaccine deployment strategy, there's continued work to be done on ensuring that we don't lose a generation of children, and really the part of that bright light at the end of the tunnel. And this piece of legislation in C92 is one of the instruments, but it'll only be lifted up properly through the leadership of people that have taken the time to listen to this and to participate in these meetings, and also others that are fighting every day as advocates for children. So thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you for having me on.
Mr. Miller, Minister Miller, do take care of yourself as well.
Thank you.
Take care.
Miigwech.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Minister Miller. That was awesome. I just want to give everyone a little, for our next session. I guess what people were confused when I said put your phone on mute. I guess what's happening is if you're only joined by phone, we still hear the microphone. So I don't know if some people have smartphones that they can be able to mute it. If you're on a house phone, I don't know if there's a muting function, but sometimes we're getting a little bit of feedback on the phones. And that's what I was meant by the phone muting as well as your laptop. In terms of our day today, I thought it was quite an amazing day. Well, quite well for our first try here as a virtual meeting. We did get the opportunity, or actually we have one presentation. We have one presentation we want to bring. The National Chief has provided us with some comments. So what we can do is probably, let's go to our presentation by the National Chief. Can we do that?
Kakia no teimtrik ni wakumaganak, ni naskamun, ni sta kananaskum tinawa kah kiel. Peri Belgar Sega Seo, Kuskateo Muskasis or Skunaganotinia, Treaty 4 Territory, Southern Saskatchewan. Anamotainan Cemento, Kanaskumitnan. Edward Sackney for the prayer, Kanaskumitnan. My friends, my relatives, I greet you all in a humble, respectful way. I'm very happy to be with you all. My name is Perry Bellegarde. I'm from Little Black Bear First Nations, Treaty 4 Territory. I want to acknowledge and give thanks to our Creator for this beautiful day. and acknowledge Edward Sackney for the prayer, for getting our gathering started in a good way for all of us. And I acknowledge all of you for being here. To all the chiefs, the leaders, the technicians, the people working in the Child and Family Services system, thank you so much for bringing your heart, your energies, and your minds to this very important gathering. You know, a few years ago at the Assembly of First Nations, we were mandated by the Chiefs Assembly to begin work on co-developing legislation to support First Nations taking control and jurisdiction over the services that affect our children and families. So First Nations experts from across all of the regions came together to make sure that the national principles, the standards and processes in this act reflected our worldviews on how to support and strengthen our families. We started working on this federal piece of legislation called Bill C-92. And we needed the experts to come together to help guide this work. Then in 2019, this historic legislation was passed in both the House of Commons and in the Senate. It became reality. It became an act. And then on January 1st of 2020, it came into force. It became law in Canada. And we've just marked 1 year since this monumental accomplishment happened. I want to acknowledge former Minister Seamus O'Regan and former Deputy Minister Jean-François Tremblay for their leadership and partnership in working with us to make this happen. I can remember, and as First Nations people, what do we do when we want something to happen in a good way? We go to ceremony. We put that first, and we ask for help. We ask for guidance from the Creator and all of our grandmothers and grandfathers to make something important for us become real. And so we took Minister Seamus O'Regan out to a sweat lodge ceremony to pray for Bill C-92, that it can come into reality, that it will have a positive impact for us. And we see that happen. We see that happening each and every day. So if we put ceremony first, that's a powerful teaching for all of us. And so I acknowledge our partners within the Government of Canada that were open-minded enough to work with us and embark on that journey together in a good way. And as First Nations leaders, you know the impact that C-92 will have, because you see the ongoing impacts of systemic racism, of colonization, and you see the impact that the policies that were put in place that were supposed to help our people, but we see how it had the impact on assimilation and how things tried to eradicate First Nations people in Canada. And now we see the impacts because we see 40,000 First Nations children in foster care. We know that's not acceptable. And we know that change has to happen very, very soon in order to stop that. And we know that First Nations know best how to support and care for our children and families. And now with this new legislation, it also recognizes and affirms our right to do this. Now, in order to operationalize this Bill C-92, First Nations need predictable, sustainable, and adequate funding that is based on needs. And it's also based on the plans that First Nations develop for themselves, because they know what's best for their children and families. And so now First Nations are starting to exert jurisdiction over child and family services. And they're working on new fiscal relationships with the Crown, not based on arbitrary formulas developed by Canada. In November of 2020, we saw an initial investment of $542 million over 5 years to advance the implementation of this act. And that's important because we know we have to begin with adequate, sustainable funding, because that also helps build and breathe and bring about capacity in First Nations people. We have advocated for $3.5 billion over 5 years to support the implementation of this legislation. And this, once realized, will help support the transition to First Nations jurisdiction as well. We know that the existing funding formula is flawed. We've always talked about how it's based on apprehension of First Nations children, not prevention. And now there's an opportunity to move towards prevention under our laws and our jurisdiction. That's a very powerful statement that we need to pick up on and implement. We're going to continue to advocate for increased investments and improve funding models that are responsive to the needs of our people, as well to the issues, concerns identified on the plans from each and every First Nations that exert their jurisdiction. You need adequate resources to implement this act. It has been just over 1 year since this new legislation has been in place. And in this time, a number of First Nations across Canada have exerted their jurisdiction and have developed their own laws over child and family services. And that is so powerful. I've said before that one of the most important clauses in Bill C-92 is that First Nations law is paramount. The inherent right to self-government, self-determination is recognized. And you are now have the capacity and are in the process of exerting your laws in your jurisdiction. Now that brings us to where we are today. We have heard a need that we have to bring together First Nations leaders and experts and those working in the field together to talk about this act and create opportunities to learn from each other. Today's session is the first of 5 that will be taking place from now until April. We've put together informative and engaging sessions to learn about the legislation and to learn from those who have the experience living and working in child and family services, and as well to learn from each other, especially with those First Nations that have created their own laws. How have they done it? How have they developed it? What policies and programs do they have in place? And can that be replicated in other First Nations across Canada? And while we're operating in this new way on this virtual platform, I hope that you will all find that we can still learn from each other, just as if we were gathered in person. I will miss sharing the meals, the ideas, and the good conversations with all of you. But I appreciate your patience as you navigate this new normal, this new way of doing business with us. I want to thank you all again. Learn from each other, talk together. Ego se, que nas continua.
Well, that's the conclusion of our National Chief's opening remarks. So thank you very much to the National Chief and his staff for putting that together for us. You can see the importance that he puts on child and family. I want to get one of those little angels that he has, so I have it on my suit for the next meeting. Speaking of the next meeting, we will be coming together again on February 9th to talk about, what is our next topic? Hear for dialogue from First Nations service providers and government officials about the Act, priorities for First Nations implementing the Act, and changes that come with implementation. So that's something to look forward to on February 9th, same bat time, same bat channel. So do circle that in your calendar. Hopefully we'll get, tell a friend, that way everyone else will bring a friend, and then we'll have double our numbers to get the word out there on the work that's being, important work that's being done out there. Today was a very eventful day. We did hear obviously from the regional chief, we heard from the national chief. Ed opened our session with some kind words, some nice words. We got the youth and the elders come together talking about their life experiences, even sharing some of the recommendations that they see or would like to see happen in the implementation of the Act. We heard from Dr. Capel Lafond, who brought, having worked on the Act, we had the expert speaking to the Act and what it does, what does it mean, what doors does it open, and also spoke a little bit even of what's missing. And also the process moving forward and how to, whatever key messages is, keep the long-term picture in mind, that this is a step towards something broader, that always to think about the broader implications and the broader things, and always think about the future. We also received really good questions, and insightful questions on our live Q&A chat throughout the day. As our time today was limited, we have recorded your questions and we'll address them in a report following the session. So all those questions you had have not been lost. Stephanie's in there working away and making sure we're tracking them and sending me ones that probably are coming from several members or several participants so I can share with our guests. There was one chief whose suggestion was creating a healing neighborhoods in First Nations to bring our children home, staffed by elders and community members to support their needs locally. So you see already this national dialogue is bringing some really good ideas to the forefront, and those will not be lost. Another participant asked about how we can support First Nations youth that age out of care who do not trust the mainstream CFS system. So How do you rebuild trust within a new system that children actually who would age out might actually come back to a system they trust? To answer the most questions, to answer the most asked questions, presentations and recordings of the proceeding today will be available on the website. So the AFN website is our support, our parallel support to our conversation here. Presentations will be put on the website. Your questions will also be answered and taken to brought to the website. So any queries and your ideas and will all be part of the conversation within here, live, virtually, and also on the website. So I think we're coming close to the end of what has been a fun-packed day of things. I see the elders ready to make this thing end. So I will defer to Elder Sakani to close our session. At the end of his words, we will stand adjourned. Miigwech, everyone. Igwa min mino.
Miigwech, Matthew. Kishmanto, no tano. Miigwech netaga pechaminya oma. Ishkatun. I want to thank the great creator for allowing us, for giving us this meeting. I ask that he looks after our chiefs, and also their councils. Help us as we deal with this children's issue. I won't really close this meeting. I'll just lower the fire, because there's going to be another day that we're going to be raising this issue up. And I think to put closure to it is going to take a lot of effort from the governments, because we're ready. I think we're ready. I think we have the leadership. By hearing Regional Chief Hart speak, the national chiefs, and also the community chiefs. I think so many are ready to do what has to be done. But it's the other side. And with Minister Miller, if we can pick up on his momentum, I think we can get somewhere. Thank you to all of you who are here. Look after yourself. I just say to all of you, take care, look after yourselves, and I thank the great creator. Miigwech, 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 miigwech.
Miigwech, Elder Sakani. If we could put up the helpline up on the website for everyone, do take care of yourself. We realize these are not easy conversations for everybody. 1-855-242-3310, hopeforwellness.ca. Do take care of yourselves, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you on February 9th.